Welcome, weary wanderer, to the peculiar town of Elmore, where reality bends like taffy and forgotten things gather in the spaces between what is and what might have been. Tonight, we explore the deepest mystery of this strange world, the void, that realm of abandonment, where discarded ideas, rejected characters, and broken dreams drift in eternal twilight. This is a story of existence and erasure, of memory and forgetting, of the thin line between being and unbeing. So settle in, let your thoughts drift like shadows, and prepare to journey into the heart of nothingness itself, where even emptiness has a story to tell. In the heart of California, nestled between the ordinary suburbs of the everyday world and the impossible landscapes of pure imagination, lies the town of Elmore, a place where the fundamental laws that govern reality seem to have been written by a committee of madmen and then edited by a child with crayons. This is not a town in any conventional sense, for Elmore exists in that strange space between what is real and what is merely dreamed, where the boundaries between different forms of existence blur like watercolors left too long in the rain. Here, in this extraordinary municipality, a blue cat named Gumball Watterson attends junior high school alongside classmates who represent every conceivable form of artistic expression that the human mind has ever conceived. There is Darwin, the goldfish who grew legs and learned to love, his evolutionary journey compressed into a single miraculous transformation that would have taken nature millions of years to accomplish. There is Anais, a pink rabbit whose intellect burns so brightly that it seems to illuminate the very air around her with the cold fire of pure thought. But it is not merely the diversity of Elmore's inhabitants that makes this place so remarkable, though diversity is certainly part of its peculiar charm. A living piece of toast named Anton walks the halls of Elmore Junior High with the same dignity as any human child, while Penny Fitzgerald exists as a shape-shifting peanut whose true form remains hidden beneath layers of protective shell and social expectation. Banana Joe brings his potassium-powered enthusiasm to every interaction, while Rocky Robinson speaks entirely in incomprehensible sounds that somehow convey meaning to those patient enough to listen. What makes Elmore truly extraordinary is not what exists within its borders, but rather the fundamental nature of existence itself in this place where anything can happen and frequently does. This is a town where the impossible is merely Tuesday afternoon, where the laws of physics are more like friendly suggestions than absolute commandments, and where the very concept of narrative coherence has been stretched to accommodate wonders that would shatter the sanity of any rational mind. The streets of Elmore curve and bend in ways that would make a geometry teacher weep with confusion, leading from suburban neighborhoods to vast wilderness areas to interdimensional shopping malls without any apparent concern for the spatial relationships that govern normal towns. Time moves differently here, sometimes speeding up to compress entire adventures into a few frantic minutes, sometimes slowing down to examine the profound philosophical implications of something as simple as choosing what to have for lunch. Yet beneath this surface chaos, beneath the bright colors and endless possibilities, there runs a current of something far more profound and troubling. Elmore operates according to rules that are not immediately apparent to casual observation. Rules that govern not just what can happen, but what is allowed to continue happening. This is a place where existence itself is conditional, where the right to be real must be earned and maintained through constant vigilance and relevance. The town functions as a kind of cosmic nexus, a meeting point where different forms of creative expression converge and interact in ways that create entirely new possibilities for storytelling and meaning. Traditional animation meets computer graphics, realistic human behavior encounters cartoon physics, and the result is a reality that accommodates every conceivable form of character and narrative structure, while somehow maintaining its own coherent identity. In this strange ecosystem of endless possibility, certain inhabitants carry what can only be described as narrative weight, an intangible quality that grants them protection from the darker aspects of Elmore's fluid reality. Gumball himself possesses this quality in abundance, his position as the central figure around which all stories revolve granting him a kind of existential immunity that lesser characters can only dream of achieving. His family, by virtue of their connection to him, shares in this protection, their relevance to his story, ensuring their continued existence in this world where being forgotten can be far more dangerous than any physical threat. But for every character who enjoys this narrative protection, there are dozens of others who exist in a more precarious state, their continued presence in Elmore dependent upon factors beyond their control. These are the background players, the supporting cast members, the ones whose names appear in credits but whose stories are never told in full. They populate the edges of more important tales, filling classrooms and crowding hallways, their individual dreams and desires subordinated to the greater narrative needs of those more fortunate souls who command the spotlight. The metaphysical mechanics that govern this hierarchy are not random or cruel by design, but rather reflect the same forces that shape all forms of storytelling across every medium and genre. In Elmore, however, these usually abstract concepts take on a concrete reality that can be observed and measured, creating a world where the relationship between creator and creation, between audience and entertainment, becomes visible in ways that would be impossible in any ordinary place. Some characters seem to understand intuitively that their existence depends upon remaining relevant, upon finding ways to contribute to the ongoing narrative that defines life in Elmore. They adapt and evolve, seeking out new roles and relationships that might secure their place in the grand story that encompasses all of their individual tales. Others, perhaps less aware of the delicate nature of their situation, simply live their lives without recognizing the invisible threads that bind them to this strange reality. The school itself serves as a microcosm of these larger forces, a place where the hierarchy of narrative importance plays out in miniature among students and staff who may not fully understand the rules that govern their world. Teachers disappear between seasons without explanation, their absence noted briefly before new instructors arrive to fill their roles. Students transfer in and out with startling frequency, their comings and goings treated as perfectly normal even when they defy all logical explanation. Principal Brown and Miss Simeon, by virtue of their consistent presence in Gumball's life, enjoy a stability that many of their colleagues lack. Their roles in the ongoing story of the Watterson family grant them a form of tenure that has nothing to do with educational qualifications and everything to do with narrative necessity. They are needed, and therefore they persist, their existence justified by their contribution to the larger tale being told. Yet, even these seemingly secure positions are not without their dangers, for Elmore's reality is nothing if not dynamic. Characters who once seemed essential can find themselves relegated to increasingly marginal roles as new stories develop and old ones reach their natural conclusions. The threat is subtle but constant, the gradual recognition that one's presence is no longer required, that the spotlight has moved on to illuminate other faces and other tales. This is the world into which young Rob was born, a reality where existence is earned rather than guaranteed, where the right to be remembered must be continually justified through ongoing relevance and contribution. He entered this strange existence as one among many, a face in the crowd of Elmore Junior High, distinguished by nothing more remarkable than his complete lack of distinction. In any ordinary town, such anonymity might be a blessing, a protection from the harsh judgment and constant scrutiny that public attention can bring. But in Elmore, where being noticed is literally a matter of survival. Rob's unremarkable nature represented the greatest possible threat to his continued existence. He was, in the most fundamental sense, forgettable, and in a place where being forgotten carries consequences far more severe than mere social isolation. This quality would prove to be his defining characteristic and ultimately his doom. The stage was set for tragedy on a scale that transcended individual suffering, a story that would reveal the hidden costs of Elmore's miraculous flexibility and expose the dark foundation upon which all of its bright wonders rested. In the shadows cast by the town's endless possibilities, something was stirring, something that had been discarded and abandoned, but had not yet learned to accept its fate quietly. The void was waiting, patient and eternal, gathering the forgotten and the abandoned into its empty embrace, preparing for the day when its existence could no longer be ignored by those fortunate enough to remain in the light. In the grand tapestry of Elmore's existence, where every thread represents a character whose story interweaves with countless others to create the rich fabric of daily life, there began to appear certain troubling patterns that few were equipped to notice, much less understand. These were not dramatic tears or obvious flaws, but rather subtle absences, small gaps where something should have been but wasn't, like missing notes in a familiar melody that leave the entire composition feeling somehow incomplete. The phenomenon manifested first in the most mundane of circumstances, in those everyday moments that form the background texture of life in any community. Students would arrive at school in the morning and settle into their usual seats, only to find themselves vaguely troubled by the sense that something was different, that the classroom felt somehow less full than it had the day before. Teachers would call roll and pause momentarily at certain names, their voices carrying a note of uncertainty, as if they were trying to remember not just who these students were, but whether they had ever truly existed at all. Rob had been attending Elmore Junior High for what felt like his entire life, yet when pressed, neither his classmates nor his instructors could recall with any clarity when he had first arrived or what circumstances had brought him to their school. He existed in a perpetual state of present tense, always there when one looked directly at him, but somehow absent from the collective memory of the community that surrounded him. His name appeared on class rosters and attendance sheets. His assignments were turned in on time and graded with mechanical efficiency, yet he left no impression on the minds of those who encountered him daily. This was not merely social invisibility of the kind that might plague any shy or unremarkable student, though it began with symptoms that could easily be mistaken for such commonplace adolescent struggles. Rob would raise his hand in class and wait patiently to be called upon, only to watch as his teacher's gaze would slide past him as if he were not there, eventually selecting another student whose contribution would be acknowledged and discussed, while Rob's eager participation went unnoticed and unremembered. In the hallways between classes, he would attempt to join conversations among his peers, offering opinions or observations that were perfectly relevant to the topics being discussed. Yet, his words seemed to carry no weight, creating no ripples in the flow of dialogue that continued around him as if he had never spoken. Other students would repeat his exact suggestions moments later and receive enthusiastic agreement, while his original contributions vanished from memory as quickly as they had been uttered. The cafeteria presented its own particular form of torment, a daily reminder of his growing disconnection from the social fabric of school life. Rob would sit at tables where he had sat for months, among students he had known for years, only to find them treating him like a stranger who had inexplicably inserted himself into their group. They were not cruel or deliberately exclusionary, but rather seemed genuinely confused by his presence, as if he were a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit the picture they were trying to complete. Even more disturbing were the occasions when his absence went entirely unnoticed, when he would skip a class or miss a day of school only to return and find that no one had registered his disappearance. Teachers did not mark him absent, classmates did not wonder where he had been, and the world of Elmore Junior High continued to function exactly as it had when he was present. These experiences left him with the unsettling realization that his participation in the life of the school was entirely optional, that nothing he did or failed to do had any meaningful impact on the ongoing narrative of his community. The pattern extended beyond the walls of the school and into every aspect of his existence in Elmore. Shopkeepers would serve him with polite efficiency but show no recognition when he returned the following day, treating each encounter as if it were their first meeting. Neighbors would wave in greeting, but with the generic friendliness reserved for strangers rather than the familiarity that should have developed over years of living in the same community. Most painful of all was the gradual recognition that even his own family seemed to be forgetting him, their interactions taking on an increasingly distant quality that suggested they were going through the motions of familial relationship without the emotional connection that should have sustained such bonds. They continued to provide for his physical needs, to include him in household routines and family activities, but their behavior carried the mechanical quality of people fulfilling obligations they couldn't quite remember making. Photography became a particular source of anxiety for Rob, as he began to notice that his image had a tendency to become blurred or distorted in ways that defied technical explanation. Group photos from school events would develop with mysterious empty spaces where he should have been standing, or his face would appear as an indistinct shadow that made identification impossible. Even candid snapshots taken by friends would somehow fail to capture his presence clearly, as if the very medium of photography was gradually forgetting how to render his appearance. The yearbook committee's struggles to document his existence provided perhaps the most concrete evidence of his fading relevance to the world around him. His name appeared in the class roster, his activities and achievements were listed in the appropriate sections, yet the photographs that should have accompanied these entries were consistently problematic. Either he was absent from group shots where he should have been present, or his individual portrait would develop as a blank rectangle that revealed nothing but empty space where his face should have appeared. These technical failures might have been dismissed as mere coincidence if they had occurred in isolation, but the pattern was too consistent and too specific to be explained by normal photographic mishaps. It was as if the very act of trying to preserve his image for posterity was being actively resisted by forces beyond human understanding, as if something in the fundamental nature of reality was working to erase all evidence of his existence. Rob's academic performance during this period presented another fascinating paradox that highlighted the strange nature of his situation. His grades remained consistently average, neither exceptional enough to attract positive attention, nor poor enough to trigger intervention from teachers or administrators. His assignments were completed and submitted on schedule. His tests were taken and scored according to standard procedures, yet none of this academic activity seemed to leave any lasting impression on the minds of those responsible for his education. Teachers would grade his work with mechanical efficiency, recording scores in their gradebooks with the same careful attention they showed to all their students, yet they retained no memory of the specific content of his submissions. His essays were read and commented upon. His mathematical solutions were checked and corrected. His laboratory reports were reviewed and filed, yet the intellectual engagement that should have accompanied these interactions was mysteriously absent. Even more tellingly, his contributions to class discussions, when they were acknowledged at all, were quickly forgotten even by those who had initially responded to them. A particularly insightful observation about literature might spark an animated debate that lasted the entire class period, Yet, by the following day, no one could recall who had first raised the point that had generated such passionate discussion. His questions and comments served their function in the moment, moving conversations forward and helping his classmates develop their own understanding. Yet his role in these intellectual exchanges was consistently erased from memory. The phenomenon extended to extracurricular activities as well, where Rob's participation followed the same pattern of present-moment involvement coupled with historical erasure. He would attend club meetings and contribute to planning discussions. His suggestions would be incorporated into group projects, and his labor would help bring various initiatives to fruition. Yet when these activities were later discussed or celebrated, his contributions would be attributed to others, or simply forgotten entirely. School plays provided a particularly poignant example of this dynamic, as Rob would audition for roles and occasionally be cast in small parts that required his presence on stage for brief but important moments. He would rehearse diligently, memorize his lines perfectly, and deliver his performances with competence and dedication. Yet programs and reviews would consistently fail to mention his participation. Photographs of cast members would somehow exclude him, despite multiple witnesses who could attest to his presence during the productions. The social dynamics of adolescent life in Elmore presented their own unique challenges for someone whose existence was gradually being erased from collective memory. Rob found himself caught in increasingly awkward situations where former friends would treat him as a stranger, not out of any desire to be cruel or exclusionary, but simply because they genuinely could not remember their previous interactions and shared experiences. Birthday parties that he had attended the previous year would be discussed in his presence as if he had never been there, with classmates sharing memories and inside jokes from events where he had been an active participant. When he would attempt to contribute his own recollections of these occasions, his comments would be met with polite confusion, as if he were claiming to have witnessed events that had occurred in his absence. The gradual erosion of his social connections was made more painful by the fact that it seemed to cause no distress to those who were forgetting him. His classmates showed no signs of missing his company or wondering what had become of their friendship with him. They simply moved forward with their lives as if he had never been a part of them, their social circles closing seamlessly around the space he had once occupied. Even romantic interests, the few tentative crushes and awkward attractions that marked his adolescent experience, would dissolve into nothingness, as the objects of his affection would lose all memory of their previous interactions. A girl who had smiled at him in the hallway for weeks would suddenly look through him as if he were transparent, not out of any change in her feelings, but because she could no longer remember that he existed as anything more than a vague background presence. The cruelest aspect of this social erasure was its complete lack of malice or intention. Rob was not being deliberately ostracized or systematically excluded by his peers. Instead, he was simply fading from their awareness, like a photograph left too long in sunlight, his image gradually becoming fainter and less distinct until it disappeared entirely from their mental landscape. As these patterns became more pronounced and more undeniable, Rob began to experience a form of existential terror that few beings have ever been forced to confront. This was not the fear of death, which at least carried with it the dignity of having existed and the possibility of being remembered by those left behind. This was something far more fundamental and horrifying: the fear of never having mattered at all, of living a life so devoid of impact that its ending would create no absence in the world. The realization that he was disappearing from existence while still technically alive filled Rob with a desperate urgency to prove his relevance, to find some way to make himself indispensable to the ongoing narrative of life in Elmore. He began to take increasingly dramatic actions, hoping that by inserting himself forcibly into important events or crises, he might be able to secure his place in the memories of those around him. These attempts at relevance often backfired spectacularly, as his efforts to help or contribute would be forgotten even more quickly than his previous, more passive forms of participation. He would solve problems that had been plaguing his classmates for weeks, only to watch as credit for the solutions was automatically attributed to others. He would prevent minor disasters through quick thinking and decisive action. Yet within hours, no one could recall that these disasters had ever been threatened, much less that he had played a role in preventing them. The most disturbing incidents occurred when Rob would attempt to document his own existence through various forms of media and record keeping. Diary entries that he had written in his own hand would fade from the pages within days, leaving behind blank paper that showed no signs of ever having been marked. Audio recordings of his voice would develop strange distortions that made his words incomprehensible, while video footage would suffer from technical glitches that rendered his image unclear or absent entirely. Even more unsettling was the discovery that physical objects associated with his presence had a tendency to disappear or become misplaced with unusual frequency. Personal belongings that he had owned for years would vanish from his room without explanation, leaving behind empty spaces that seemed somehow too small to have ever contained anything of significance. Gifts that he had given to friends would be lost or thrown away, not out of any lack of appreciation, but because the recipients would forget that they had ever received them or who had been responsible for their acquisition. The architectural spaces that Rob inhabited also seemed to be affected by his fading presence, though in ways that were so subtle as to be almost imperceptible to casual observation. His bedroom in the family home would gradually become smaller and more cramped, as if the house itself was slowly forgetting that it needed to accommodate his existence. His desk at school would shrink until it could barely hold his books and supplies, while his locker would develop mysterious storage problems that made it increasingly difficult for him to keep his possessions organized and accessible. These physical changes were accompanied by a growing sense of temporal displacement, as if Rob's experience of time was becoming increasingly disconnected from that of the people around him. Conversations that he remembered having would be denied by their participants. Events that he clearly recalled would be contradicted by the testimony of multiple witnesses, and shared experiences that had seemed meaningful at the time would be dismissed as products of his imagination. The ultimate horror of Rob's situation was not that he was being actively persecuted or deliberately erased by some malevolent force, but rather that his disappearance was occurring through a kind of cosmic indifference, a universe that simply could not be bothered to remember that he had ever existed. He was not being destroyed so much as being gradually edited out of reality, like a character in a story whose role had been deemed unnecessary by an author who could no longer remember why they had included him in the first place. As the boundaries between existence and non-existence began to blur around him, Rob faced a terrible choice that would define the rest of his increasingly uncertain future. He could accept his fate with dignity and allow himself to fade quietly into whatever realm awaited those who were no longer remembered by the world they had once inhabited. Or he could fight against his erasure with every resource at his disposal, seeking some way to force the universe to acknowledge his presence and grant him the recognition that seemed to be his only hope for continued existence. The path he chose would lead him into territories far stranger and more dangerous than anything he had previously imagined, into realms where the very concepts of being and unbeing took on meanings that transcended ordinary understanding. The void was calling to him, offering sanctuary for the forgotten and the abandoned, but also presenting challenges that would test the very foundations of his identity and his determination to be remembered. In the growing darkness that surrounded his fading existence, Rob began to hear whispers of others who had faced similar fates, voices that spoke of a place beyond memory, where the discarded and the rejected could find a kind of peace. Yet he also sensed that this peace came at a price that might be more than any conscious being could bear to pay, a surrender of self that would make his current struggles seem trivial by comparison. The stage was set for a confrontation between the forces of remembrance and forgetfulness, between the desire to exist and the apparent impossibility of maintaining that existence in a world that had already moved on to more interesting stories. Rob stood at the threshold, between being and unbeing, his very presence in that liminal space creating ripples that would eventually reach the consciousness of those who still dwelt securely in the realm of the remembered and the relevant. The tragedy of Rob's existence reached its most acute phase during what should have been the most formative and memorable years of any young person's life, those precious months and seasons of adolescence, when friendships are forged in the fires of shared experience and individual identity begins to crystallize into something approaching its adult form. Yet for Rob, these crucial developmental periods became instead a prolonged exercise in existential horror as he watched his own relevance to the world around him diminish with each passing day like a candle burning lower in an airless room. His mornings began with the increasingly familiar ritual of awakening in a bedroom that seemed to grow smaller and more cramped with each sunrise, as if the house itself was gradually forgetting that it needed to accommodate his presence within its walls. The family photographs that lined the hallway outside his room told a story of progressive erasure that would have been heartbreaking if anyone had been capable of remembering enough to feel heartbroken about it. Earlier pictures showed Rob clearly and prominently among his relatives, his smile genuine and his placement natural within the composition of family gatherings and holiday celebrations. More recent photographs revealed a different pattern entirely, with Rob's image becoming increasingly blurred and indistinct, his face often obscured by shadow or motion blur that seemed to target him specifically while leaving everyone else in sharp focus. The breakfast table provided daily confirmation of his fading status within his own household, where conversations would flow around him as if he were not present, his family members discussing plans and sharing observations with the casual intimacy of people who had long since forgotten that their circle included anyone beyond themselves. When Rob would attempt to contribute to these discussions, his words would be met with polite but distant acknowledgement, the kind of response one might give to a stranger who had somehow wandered into a private conversation and was trying to participate despite having no real understanding of the context or the relationships involved. His parents, who had once known every detail of his daily life and taken genuine interest in his hopes and dreams and fears, now treated him with the mechanical courtesy that one might show to a houseguest whose visit had extended beyond the bounds of normal hospitality. They continued to provide for his physical needs with the same conscientiousness they had always shown, preparing his meals and washing his clothes and maintaining his living space with careful attention to detail. Yet these acts of care carried no emotional weight, no sense of connection between the caregiver and the one being cared for. The journey to school each morning became an increasingly surreal experience, as Rob would walk the same familiar streets he had traveled for years while feeling like an intruder in his own neighborhood. Houses that had once represented the homes of friends and acquaintances now seemed like strangers' dwellings, their windows looking out upon him with the blank indifference reserved for those who do not belong. Neighbors who had once greeted him by name would nod politely if they acknowledged his presence at all, their expressions carrying that particular form of social confusion that arises when one encounters someone who seems vaguely familiar but cannot be placed within any meaningful context. The school building itself began to feel increasingly hostile to his presence, though not through any active malevolence, but rather through the more insidious process of simply forgetting that he had any legitimate claim to occupy its spaces. His locker, which had once opened reliably and provided adequate storage for his books and personal belongings, now seemed to resist his efforts to use it, the combination lock becoming more difficult to operate, and the interior space somehow insufficient for items that had fit comfortably just weeks before. Classrooms that had once felt welcoming and familiar now carried an atmosphere of subtle wrongness whenever Rob entered them, as if his presence was disrupting some natural order that functioned more smoothly in his absence. Teachers would glance at him with momentary confusion when he took his usual seat, their expressions suggesting that they were trying to remember whether he belonged in their class or had somehow wandered in from somewhere else. Roll call became an exercise in existential uncertainty, with his name being pronounced with increasing hesitancy, as if the speaker was no longer confident that the person they were addressing actually existed. The academic work that had once provided Rob with at least some sense of purpose and accomplishment began to lose all meaning as his efforts were forgotten almost as quickly as they were completed. Essays that he labored over for hours would be graded and returned with mechanical efficiency, yet his teachers retained no memory of their content or quality. Mathematical problems that he solved correctly would be marked as such in the grade book, yet the instructors who had reviewed his work could not recall having seen his solutions or having any interaction with him regarding the material. Group projects presented their own particular form of torture, as Rob would contribute ideas and labor that were essential to the successful completion of assigned tasks, only to watch as credit for his contributions was automatically attributed to other team members. His research would be incorporated into final presentations without acknowledgement. His creative suggestions would be implemented without recognition, and his organizational efforts would facilitate successful outcomes that were celebrated by everyone except the person who had made them possible. The cafeteria became a daily reminder of his social isolation, though isolation was perhaps not the correct term for a phenomenon that went deeper than mere loneliness. Rob was not being actively excluded by his classmates, nor were they deliberately ignoring him or treating him with cruelty. Instead, they seemed genuinely unable to perceive him as anything more than a vague background presence, someone who occupied space at their table, but who had no real identity or significance in their social universe. Conversations would swirl around him with the casual intimacy of old friends sharing private jokes and personal observations. Yet when he would attempt to participate, his contributions would create the kind of awkward pause that occurs when a stranger tries to insert themselves into discussions where they do not belong. His classmates would not respond with hostility or annoyance, but rather with the polite confusion of people who were unsure how to react to input from someone they could not quite remember inviting to join their group. The phenomenon extended to romantic interests as well, though Rob's attempts at forming meaningful connections with his peers were hampered not only by his fading relevance, but also by the increasingly dreamlike quality of his interactions with others. A girl who had smiled at him in the hallway for weeks would suddenly look through him as if he were transparent, not because her feelings had changed, but because she could no longer form memories that included his presence. Conversations that had seemed to be developing into something deeper would be forgotten by the other participant within hours, leaving Rob with the painful awareness that experiences he treasured as evidence of human connection existed only in his own increasingly isolated consciousness. Sports and extracurricular activities offered no refuge from this pattern of progressive erasure, as Rob's participation in these areas of school life followed the same trajectory from recognition to invisibility that characterized all of his other endeavors. His performance on athletic teams was competent but unremarkable, his contributions noted and utilized in the moment but forgotten as soon as the immediate need had passed. Coaches would include him in game plans and training exercises with mechanical efficiency, yet they retained no memory of his individual strengths or weaknesses, treating him with the generic approach they might use for any interchangeable team member. Drama club proved particularly painful, as Rob discovered that even when his presence was literally essential to the success of a production, his contributions would be erased from memory as soon as the curtain fell. He would memorize lines and deliver performances that served their function within the larger work. Yet programs and reviews would consistently fail to mention his participation. Cast parties would proceed as if he had never been involved in the production, with his fellow actors sharing memories of rehearsals and performances that had included him while somehow managing to edit his presence out of their recollections entirely. The yearbook committee's struggles to document his existence provided some of the most concrete and disturbing evidence of his fading relevance to the world around him. His name continued to appear in appropriate sections. His academic achievements were listed with bureaucratic precision, and his participation in various activities was duly recorded. Yet the visual evidence that should have accompanied these entries proved consistently problematic. Group photographs would develop with mysterious blank spaces where he should have been standing. Individual portraits would emerge from the darkroom as featureless rectangles, and candid shots that clearly showed him participating in school events would somehow fail to capture his image with any clarity or definition. The photography teacher, when pressed about these technical failures, could offer no explanation that made sense within the bounds of normal understanding. The cameras functioned perfectly when photographing other subjects. The film was fresh and properly stored. The developing chemicals were mixed according to standard procedures, yet something about Rob's presence seemed to confuse the very medium of photography, as if light itself was beginning to forget how to interact with his physical form. Even more disturbing was the discovery that existing photographs of Rob were beginning to deteriorate in ways that defied normal explanation. Images that had been clear and well-defined when first developed would gradually become blurred and indistinct over time, his face becoming harder to make out even in pictures that had been taken just months earlier. Family albums that had once proudly displayed his growth from childhood through adolescence now told a story of gradual disappearance, with his image becoming fainter and less substantial in direct proportion to how recently the photographs had been taken. Home videos presented similar problems, with Rob's voice becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish from background noise, and his physical presence somehow failing to register clearly on magnetic tape. Recordings of family gatherings and school events would play back with strange audio distortions whenever he spoke, while his movements would be captured as indistinct shadows that made it impossible to identify him with certainty. The technology that should have preserved his existence for posterity seemed instead to be actively conspiring in his erasure from the historical record. As these phenomena became more pronounced and more undeniable, Rob began to experience periods of dissociation that left him questioning not only his relevance to others, but his own fundamental reality. There were moments when he would look in mirrors and see only a vague approximation of his own reflection, as if the glass itself was uncertain about what image it should be displaying. His handwriting would become increasingly illegible even to himself, the letters seeming to shift and blur as he wrote them, making it difficult to produce coherent notes or assignments. The very act of speaking began to feel increasingly uncertain, as Rob would find himself questioning whether the words he thought he had spoken had actually been vocalized or had remained trapped in his consciousness. Conversations that he was certain he had participated in would be denied by their supposed participants, leaving him to wonder whether these interactions had occurred only in his imagination, or whether they had been forgotten so completely that they might as well have never happened. Physical sensations became unreliable as well, with Rob sometimes feeling as if he was experiencing the world through layers of insulation that muffled not only sound and vision, but also touch and temperature. Food would lose its taste, Textures would become indistinct, and even pain would seem somehow remote and disconnected from his immediate experience. It was as if his nervous system itself was beginning to forget how to process sensory information, adding another layer to his growing disconnection from the reality that surrounded him. Sleep offered no respite from these troubles, as Rob's dreams became increasingly populated by landscapes of emptiness and abandonment that seemed to reflect his waking situation with disturbing accuracy. He would find himself wandering through versions of familiar places that had been stripped of their inhabitants, walking through empty school hallways and deserted neighborhoods where no trace remained of the people who should have populated these spaces. These dreams carried a quality of prophecy that left him waking with the terrible conviction that he was seeing glimpses of his own future, visions of a world that had moved on without him, and forgotten that he had ever existed within it. The few attempts Rob made to document his experiences and preserve some record of his existence met with the same mysterious failures that plagued all other efforts to capture his presence in any permanent form. Diary entries would fade from pages within days of being written, leaving behind blank paper that showed no signs of ever having been marked. Audio recordings of his thoughts and observations would develop incomprehensible distortions that made his words impossible to understand, while attempts to create video logs would result in footage that showed empty rooms and corridors with only disembodied voices to suggest that anyone had ever been present. Even his attempts to leave physical evidence of his existence were frustrated by phenomena that seemed to target specifically those traces that might have proven his relevance to the world around him. Notes that he would leave for family members would disappear before they could be read. Gifts that he would prepare for friends would be misplaced or forgotten before they could be given, and projects that he would work on with dedication and care would somehow become associated with other people who would receive credit for his efforts without ever understanding how they had come to be responsible for work they could not remember doing. The ultimate cruelty of Rob's situation was that his fading from existence was occurring through a process so gradual and so subtle that it created no alarm or concern among those who might have been expected to notice and care about his disappearance. His family continued their daily routines with mechanical precision. His teachers maintained their academic responsibilities with professional competence, and his classmates pursued their social and educational goals with the energy and enthusiasm appropriate to their age, yet none of them registered the absence of someone who had once been an integral part of their shared experience. This was not the dramatic erasure of science fiction stories, where individuals vanish suddenly and completely, leaving behind clear evidence of temporal manipulation or reality alteration. Instead, Rob was experiencing something far more insidious and terrifying, a form of existential editing that removed him from the ongoing narrative of life in Elmore so smoothly and naturally that his absence created no disruption in the flow of events that continued around him. The realization that his disappearance from existence would cause no grief or disruption filled Rob with a despair that transcended ordinary sadness and entered realms of philosophical horror that few conscious beings have ever been forced to confront. This was not merely the fear of death, which at least carries with it the possibility of being mourned and remembered by those left behind. This was something far more fundamental and devastating: the recognition that his entire existence had been so devoid of significance that its ending would create no perceptible change in the world that had once contained him. As the boundaries between his consciousness and the external reality continued to blur and weaken, Rob began to sense the presence of something vast and empty, calling to him from spaces that existed beyond the normal dimensions of Elmore's already flexible reality. This presence offered no comfort or reassurance, yet it carried with it a quality of understanding that was absent from all of his interactions with the inhabitants of the conventional world. Here, finally, was something that acknowledged his existence, even if that acknowledgement came from a realm that existed specifically to contain and isolate those who had been forgotten by everything else. The void was reaching out to claim him, not through any active malevolence, but through the simple operation of cosmic laws that govern the relationship between relevance and existence in a universe where stories determined the fundamental nature of reality. Rob stood at the threshold between being and unbeing, his very presence in that liminal space creating disturbances that would eventually ripple outward to affect the consciousness of those who still dwelt securely in the realm of the remembered and the narratively significant. His journey into irrelevance was approaching its inevitable conclusion. Yet, even in the face of this ultimate abandonment, some spark of defiance continued to burn within his fading consciousness. The boy who had once simply wanted to be noticed and remembered was about to discover that there are fates far stranger than obscurity and powers far more terrible than the simple inability to matter to others. In the depths of his despair, Rob was about to be offered an opportunity that would change not only his own existence, but the fundamental nature of reality itself in ways that no one, least of all the comfortable inhabitants of Elmore's bright and cheerful surface world, could possibly have anticipated or prepared for. Beyond the carefully maintained boundaries of Elmore's bright and bustling reality, past the comfortable certainties of physics and causality that govern the daily lives of its inhabitants, there exists a realm that defies every attempt at rational description or conventional understanding. The void stretches endlessly in all directions that have no names, a space that is not merely empty but actively opposed to the very concept of existence, where the absence of things has achieved a kind of terrible consciousness of its own. To describe the void in terms that minds accustomed to substance and form can comprehend requires a fundamental reimagining of what it means for something to exist. This is not darkness, for darkness implies the absence of light, and light is itself a thing that can be measured and understood. The void transcends such simple oppositions, existing in a state that is neither light nor dark, but rather constitutes a complete negation of the possibility that such distinctions might have any meaning. The landscape, if such a term can be applied to something that actively resists all attempts at geographic description, appears to the consciousness of those unfortunate enough to find themselves within its boundaries as an endless expanse of white that somehow manages to be less substantial than the most transparent mist. This whiteness is not the white of snow or paper or any earthly substance, but rather the white of complete conceptual absence, the color that remains when all other colors have been not merely removed but forgotten to have ever existed. The ground beneath one's feet, assuming that concepts like ground and feet retain any meaning in such a place, provides neither the comfort of solidity nor the uncertainty of liquid instability. Instead, it offers a surface that exists only because consciousness requires some point of reference to prevent complete dissolution into the surrounding nothingness. Those who walk upon this non-substance report that each step feels simultaneously like treading upon the most solid stone and like moving through empty air, as if the very act of locomotion is being redefined with each moment of contact. The sky above, though sky is perhaps too generous a term for the infinite absence that stretches overhead, mirrors the ground in its commitment to providing no visual anchor points or markers that might allow for navigation or orientation. There are no clouds to break the monotony of whiteness, no sun to provide warmth or direction, no stars to offer the comfort of distant light. The illumination that allows vision to function at all comes from no identifiable source, but rather seems to emanate from the absence itself, as if emptiness had learned to glow with its own peculiar radiance. Time moves differently in the void. though different implies a comparison to some standard of temporal measurement that simply does not apply in a realm where cause and effect have been stripped of their logical relationships. Moments stretch into eternities, while years compress into instantaneous experiences, creating a temporal landscape where memory and anticipation lose their meaning, and consciousness is forced to exist in a perpetual present that refuses to acknowledge either past or future. The psychological effects of existing within such a space begin to manifest almost immediately upon arrival, though the concept of arrival suggests a journey from somewhere else that may itself be suspect for those who find themselves in the void without clear recollection of how they came to be there. The human mind evolved to process information about a world filled with objects and relationships, surfaces and depths, sounds and silences, struggles to maintain coherence when presented with an environment that negates all of these fundamental categories. The first sensation that newcomers to the void typically experience is a profound disorientation that goes far deeper than simple confusion about location or direction. This is a disorientation of being itself, a sudden uncertainty about whether one continues to exist in any meaningful sense or has instead become part of the surrounding emptiness. The boundaries between self and environment, which normally provide the basic framework for conscious experience, begin to blur and dissolve in ways that challenge the very foundation of individual identity. Speech becomes problematic in the void, not because sound cannot travel through its strange atmosphere, but because the concepts that language exists to communicate lose their relevance in a space where nothing can be compared to anything else. Words spoken aloud take on a hollow quality that suggests they are being absorbed by the emptiness rather than reflected back to create the auditory feedback that normal conversation requires. Even internal monologue, that constant stream of verbal thought that accompanies most conscious experience, becomes hesitant and uncertain, as if the mind itself is beginning to question whether it has anything meaningful to say. The absence of sensory input that characterizes normal environments creates its own form of sensory overload. As consciousness attempts to fill the void with phantom perceptions that have no basis in external reality, inhabitants report hearing voices that speak no words, seeing movement where nothing moves, feeling touches from hands that do not exist. These experiences are not hallucinations in any clinical sense, but rather desperate attempts by awareness itself to maintain some connection to the concepts of perception and interaction that define normal existence. Memory undergoes particularly dramatic transformations within the void's influence, as the recollection of experiences that occurred in places where things actually existed becomes increasingly difficult to maintain with any clarity or confidence. The details of life in substantial reality begin to fade, not through the normal process of forgetting, but through a more fundamental questioning of whether such experiences could ever have been real. Did colors actually exist? Or were they merely concepts that consciousness invented to make sense of meaningless variations in light? Did other people truly have independent existence? Or were they projections of a mind that could not accept its essential isolation? These doubts grow stronger and more pervasive the longer one remains in the void, fed by an environment that provides no evidence to contradict them, and no anchoring points that might restore confidence in the reality of previous experience. The phenomenon creates a feedback loop where increasing doubt about the past makes it more difficult to maintain a sense of personal identity, which in turn makes it harder to trust one's memories, which accelerates the process of disconnection from any secure foundation of selfhood. Physical form, that most basic assertion of individual existence, becomes increasingly uncertain within the void's boundaries. Bodies that enter this realm retain their basic structure and function, but they begin to feel somehow less substantial, as if they were slowly becoming transparent to themselves. Inhabitants report looking down at their hands and feeling uncertain whether they are actually seeing them or merely remembering what hands are supposed to look like. The sensation of breathing continues, but without the normal awareness of air moving in and out of lungs, creating a peculiar sense of going through the motions of life while being cut off from the physical processes that normally sustain it. The phenomenon extends to the basic biological needs that normally provide structure and urgency to daily existence. Hunger and thirst, those most fundamental drives that anchor consciousness to bodily reality, begin to fade into abstract concepts rather than immediate sensations. Sleep becomes unnecessary, or perhaps impossible, as the distinction between waking and dreaming loses its meaning in a place where all experience has taken on the quality of half-remembered dreams. The circadian rhythms that normally regulate mental and physical states become irrelevant in the absence of day and night, creating a strange form of temporal jet lag that never resolves itself. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect of existence in the void is not what it takes away from those who find themselves within its borders, but what it gives them in return. In the absence of external stimuli and normal social interaction, consciousness begins to turn inward with an intensity that would be overwhelming in any other environment. The constant chatter of everyday thought, normally modulated by the need to respond to external demands and social expectations, expands to fill the entire field of awareness with an amplified version of one's own mental processes. This forced introspection can lead to profound insights about the nature of identity and existence, but it can also create a form of psychological claustrophobia, where consciousness becomes trapped within its own recursive loops of thought and feeling. Without the normal outlets for mental energy provided by interaction with a substantial world, the mind begins to feed upon itself in ways that can be either illuminating or destructive, depending upon the particular psychological makeup of the individual involved. The social dynamics that develop among the inhabitants of the void reflect these altered states of consciousness in ways that would seem impossible or nonsensical to observers from the substantial world. Relationships form and dissolve based not on shared activities or common interests, but on the compatibility of internal psychological states and the ability to provide mutual recognition of continued existence. The simple acknowledgement that another being remains real becomes a precious gift that can sustain hope and identity in ways that transcend normal human bonding. Communication among the voided takes on forms that bypass the normal requirements of language and gesture, operating instead through a kind of direct transmission of mental states that might be described as telepathy, if such a term did not imply more structure and intentionality than the actual phenomenon possesses. Ideas and emotions pass between individuals without the mediation of words or expressions, creating a form of intimacy that is simultaneously deeper and more alienating than anything possible in the substantial world. The architectural features that do exist within the void seem to materialize in response to the psychological needs of its inhabitants rather than according to any external plan or design. Structures appear that serve as gathering places or shelters, not because they are built through any conventional process of construction, but because the collective unconscious of the voided population has generated a shared need for such spaces. These buildings, if they can be called that, possess the same insubstantial quality as everything else in the void, existing more as concepts made visible than as actual physical constructions. The most significant of these spontaneous architectural manifestations is a structure that serves as a kind of central meeting hall or community center, where newly arrived inhabitants can be oriented to their circumstances and existing residents can maintain some semblance of social contact. This building, which appears differently to each observer depending upon their psychological associations with concepts of safety and community, provides a gathering point for beings who might otherwise drift apart into the infinite emptiness and lose all connection with others of their kind. Within this central space, informal hierarchies develop based not on traditional markers of status or authority, but on factors like length of residence in the void, psychological stability under the unique stresses of voided existence, and the ability to help newcomers adapt to their circumstances. These hierarchies are fluid and constantly shifting, as the normal social dynamics that create stable power structures cannot operate effectively in an environment where individual identity itself is under constant threat of dissolution. The governance of the void, insofar as such a term can be applied to a realm that exists outside normal causality, operates according to principles that reflect the unique nature of its environment and inhabitants. There are no formal laws or regulations, as the concepts that such rules would govern have little meaning in a space where conventional notions of property, territory, and individual rights cannot be sustained. Instead, order emerges through a kind of collective unconscious consensus about what behaviors are necessary for maintaining the minimal conditions required for continued existence. The closest thing to formal authority that exists in the void comes from those individuals who have demonstrated the rare ability to maintain stable psychological function while helping others navigate the challenges of voided existence. These informal leaders serve as guides and counselors rather than rulers, their influence derived from their capacity to provide practical assistance and emotional support to beings who are struggling with the fundamental question of whether they continue to exist in any meaningful sense. The economy of the void, if such a term can be applied to a realm where material scarcity has no meaning, operates through the exchange of psychological resources rather than physical goods or services. The most valuable currency is attention itself, the simple acknowledgement that another being exists and has significance within the community of the voided. This attention can be given and received in various forms, from direct interaction and conversation to more subtle forms of recognition and validation. The scarcity that drives this psychological economy comes not from any limitation of material resources, but from the constant threat that individual consciousness faces in an environment that actively works to dissolve the boundaries of personal identity. The attention and recognition that one receives from others serves as a crucial anchor to selfhood, providing external validation of one's continued existence that can counteract the dissolving effects of the surrounding emptiness. This creates a complex social dynamic where the psychological health of each individual becomes intimately connected to their ability to maintain meaningful relationships with others, yet where the very conditions that make such relationships necessary also make them more difficult to sustain. The result is a community bound together by mutual need, yet constantly threatened by the centrifugal forces that seek to scatter its members into isolated psychological fragments. The phenomena that govern the void's relationship to the substantial world operate according to laws that exist somewhere between physics and metaphysics, creating bridges between existence and non-existence that allow for limited forms of interaction between the voided and the still real. These connections manifest primarily through the persistence of memory traces and emotional resonances that continue to link the forgotten to those who once knew them, though these links grow weaker and more tenuous with each passing moment of separation. The most direct form of connection occurs through the dreams and subconscious experiences of inhabitants of the substantial world, where fragments of voided consciousness can sometimes manifest as half-remembered faces or names that seem familiar but cannot be placed within any clear context. These dream encounters provide brief opportunities for the voided to assert their continued existence, and for the still real to experience fleeting moments of recognition that something important has been lost, though the specific nature of that loss remains frustratingly unclear. More significant, but far rarer, are the instances where voided beings manage to assert enough psychological coherence to create temporary manifestations within substantial reality, appearing as barely visible figures or disembodied voices that can be perceived by those with sufficient sensitivity to such phenomena. These manifestations require enormous effort and can only be sustained for brief periods before the forces that govern the void reassert their influence and pull the manifesting consciousness back into the realm of the forgotten. The environmental conditions within the void undergo subtle but constant changes that reflect the psychological states of its inhabitants and the overall balance between existence and non-existence that characterizes the entire realm. During periods when the voided community achieves greater stability and mutual support, the whiteness that surrounds them takes on slightly warmer tones, and the ground beneath their feet feels marginally more solid. Conversely, when despair or dissolution threatens the psychological coherence of the group, the environment becomes even more insubstantial and difficult to navigate. These environmental fluctuations serve as a kind of collective mood indicator that allows inhabitants to gauge the overall health of their community without needing to engage in direct communication or assessment. The ability to read these subtle changes becomes a crucial survival skill for anyone hoping to maintain long-term psychological stability within the void's boundaries, as it provides early warning of conditions that might threaten individual or collective dissolution. The most dramatic environmental changes occur during what inhabitants have learned to recognize as storm periods, when the fundamental forces that maintain the void's existence become unstable and threaten to either collapse the realm entirely or merge it catastrophically with substantial reality. These storms manifest as waves of even more intense emptiness that sweep across the landscape, threatening to dissolve not only individual consciousness, but the very possibility that consciousness could ever have existed. During such periods, the survival of voided beings depends upon their ability to band together and provide mutual reinforcement for each other's continued existence, creating networks of shared identity that can resist the dissolving forces more effectively than any individual consciousness could manage alone. These crisis periods serve to strengthen the bonds within the voided community, while also demonstrating the precarious nature of their existence and the constant vigilance required to maintain even the minimal conditions necessary for continued awareness. The ultimate mystery that surrounds the void concerns its purpose and origin, questions that may not have answers in any conventional sense, but that nevertheless drive much of the philosophical speculation that occupies the minds of its more contemplatively inclined inhabitants. Some theorize that the void serves as a necessary component of the cosmic order, a recycling center for consciousness that has become disconnected from its original contexts and needs to be processed before it can be reintegrated into substantial reality in new forms. Others suggest that the void represents a kind of cosmic mistake, an unintended consequence of the forces that govern narrative reality in places like Elmore, where the emphasis on relevance and memorability has created a realm of exile for everything that fails to meet these criteria. According to this theory, the void continues to exist because the substantial world requires somewhere to put the things it discards, but its nature and properties are essentially accidental rather than designed. A third perspective holds that the void is actually the most fundamental layer of reality, the baseline state from which all existence emerges and to which it eventually returns. From this viewpoint, substantial reality, with its objects and relationships, its colors and sounds and textures, represents a temporary deviation from the natural order rather than the normal state of things. The voided, according to this interpretation, have not been exiled from reality, but have instead achieved a more direct connection to the underlying nature of existence itself. These philosophical debates serve important psychological functions for the inhabitants of the void, providing intellectual frameworks that can help make sense of their circumstances, while also creating opportunities for the kind of abstract discussion that can maintain mental acuity in an environment that offers few other forms of intellectual stimulation. The fact that these questions may have no definitive answers becomes less important than their capacity to generate ongoing thought and conversation among beings who might otherwise succumb to the dissolving influence of their surroundings. As consciousness adapts to existence within the void's unique conditions, it begins to develop capabilities and perceptions that would be impossible in substantial reality, though whether these represent genuine expansions of awareness or elaborate hallucinations created by minds struggling to maintain coherence remains an open question. Some inhabitants report achieving forms of direct knowledge that bypass the normal processes of observation and inference, gaining immediate insight into the fundamental nature of reality and consciousness that transcends anything available through conventional experience. Others describe developing the ability to perceive multiple dimensions of existence simultaneously, seeing not only the current state of the void, but also glimpses of alternate realities where different choices or circumstances might have led to different outcomes. These visions may represent genuine metaphysical insights, or may simply be the products of consciousness, freed from the normal constraints of linear time and causal relationships. But regardless of their ultimate validity, they provide sources of wonder and contemplation that can help sustain hope and curiosity even in the face of existential uncertainty. The most profound transformation that occurs within the void involves the gradual dissolution of the normal boundaries between individual consciousness and collective awareness, creating forms of shared experience that transcend the isolation that characterizes normal existence. As personal identity becomes less stable and less clearly defined, the barriers that normally separate one mind from another begin to weaken, allowing for forms of communion and mutual understanding that approach the mystical in their intensity and scope. This collective consciousness does not represent the complete loss of individual identity, but rather its expansion into forms that can encompass multiple perspectives and experiences simultaneously. Inhabitants who achieve this level of integration report feeling simultaneously more themselves and more connected to others than they ever experienced in substantial reality, as if the forced isolation of normal existence had finally been overcome through the paradoxical embrace of emptiness itself. Within the endless expanse of the void, where individual consciousness struggles against the dissolving forces of absolute emptiness, there exists a community of beings whose very presence defies the fundamental nature of their surroundings. These are the inhabitants of nothingness, the citizens of absence, souls who have found ways to maintain some semblance of identity and purpose, even in a realm that actively works to erase all traces of existence from the cosmic record. At the heart of this impossible community stands Molly Collins, a figure whose significance to the functioning of voided society far exceeds what her modest demeanor and gentle manner might initially suggest. She serves as both welcome committee and survival guide for the countless beings who find themselves suddenly and inexplicably deposited within the void's boundaries, offering the first friendly face that many newcomers encounter in their transition from substantial reality to the realm of the forgotten. Molly's own journey to the void began in ways that exemplify the subtle yet devastating processes that can lead to existential erasure. She had been a student at Elmore Junior High, a presence so thoroughly unremarkable that she seemed to exist in a state of perpetual background, neither actively noticed nor particularly missed, when her attendance became sporadic and eventually ceased altogether. Her erasure from the collective memory of her classmates and teachers occurred so gradually and naturally that no one thought to question her absence or investigate what might have happened to cause her disappearance from their daily experience. Unlike Rob, whose fading from reality was accompanied by increasing desperation and frantic attempts to reassert his relevance, Molly had approached her own dissolution with a kind of resigned acceptance that spoke to a fundamentally different relationship with the concept of mattering to others. She had never harbored illusions about her own importance, or entertained fantasies about achieving recognition or fame. Instead, she had lived quietly and contentedly on the margins of other people's stories, finding satisfaction in small kindnesses and modest accomplishments that required no external validation. This psychological disposition, which might have seemed like a disadvantage in the competitive social environment of adolescence, proved to be precisely the kind of mental preparation that allowed Molly to adapt successfully to existence within the void, where others might rage against the dissolution of their identity or sink into despair at their abandonment by the substantial world. Molly approached her circumstances with curiosity and compassion, seeking to understand her new environment while also looking for ways to help others navigate the same challenging transition. Her first weeks in the void were spent in the kind of methodical exploration that characterized her approach to any new situation, walking the endless white expanses and cataloging the subtle variations in emptiness that marked different regions of this impossible territory. She discovered that while the void appeared uniformly featureless to casual observation, it actually contained areas of distinct character and atmosphere that could serve as landmarks for navigation and meeting points for social interaction. In one region, the whiteness carried undertones of warmth that seemed to emanate from some unidentifiable source, creating a space that felt marginally more welcoming and less psychologically threatening than the surrounding emptiness. Molly designated this area as an informal gathering spot where newcomers could be brought for their initial orientation to voided existence, a place where the usual disorientation and terror of arrival could be somewhat mitigated by environmental conditions that provided at least minimal comfort. Another area manifested what could only be described as acoustic properties, though sound itself remained as problematic in the void as every other sensory experience. Here, voices carried further and with greater clarity than elsewhere, making it possible for inhabitants to engage in conversations across distances that would normally render communication impossible. Molly recognized the potential value of this acoustic anomaly for maintaining community connections and designated it as a forum for the kind of large group discussions that helped bind the scattered population together. Her most significant discovery was a region where the psychological pressure of dissolution seemed slightly less intense, creating conditions that allowed for more stable maintenance of individual identity and clearer thinking about practical problems. This area became the site of the void's closest approximation to a town center, where the informal leadership that governed the community could gather to discuss matters of collective concern, and where newcomers could receive more intensive support during their most vulnerable early days of adjustment. The process of helping others adapt to voided existence became Molly's primary occupation and the source of whatever sense of purpose and meaning her new circumstances could provide. Each arrival presented unique challenges that required careful assessment and individualized approaches. As the psychological makeup that had led different beings to the void varied dramatically, and their capacity for adaptation depended upon factors that were not always immediately apparent. Some newcomers arrived in states of complete psychological collapse, their consciousness so fragmented by the trauma of erasure that they could barely maintain coherent thought or recognize the reality of their circumstances. These individuals required intensive support and patient care, often needing to be quite literally held together through the crisis period when their sense of self threatened to dissolve entirely into the surrounding emptiness. Others came to the void with their faculties intact but filled with rage and indignation at their abandonment by substantial reality, their anger, providing a kind of psychological armor that protected them from immediate dissolution, but also made them resistant to accepting the help and guidance that their long-term survival would require. Molly learned to work with these angry newcomers carefully, neither challenging their right to their fury, nor allowing that fury to isolate them from the community support they desperately needed. The most heartbreaking cases were those who arrived with their hopes still intact, beings who maintained faith that their presence in the void was temporary, and that they would soon be restored to their proper place in substantial reality. These individuals often possessed a kind of tragic nobility that made their eventual acceptance of their circumstances particularly poignant, as they gradually came to understand that their exile was permanent, and that adaptation, rather than rescue, represented their only viable path forward. Molly's approach to helping these various types of newcomers drew upon insights she had developed through her own successful navigation of voided existence, combined with hard-won experience about what approaches proved most effective under different circumstances. She had learned that direct confrontation with the reality of the void often produced psychological shock that could accelerate rather than prevent the dissolution of individual consciousness, while gentle introduction and graduated exposure allowed newcomers to build psychological resilience at a pace their minds could handle. Her standard procedure began with simple presence and acknowledgement, the basic human courtesy of recognizing that the newcomer existed and had significance regardless of what forces had brought them to the void. This recognition often came as a profound relief to beings who had spent their final days in substantial reality feeling increasingly invisible and irrelevant, providing immediate validation that they retained their essential humanity despite their changed circumstances. The next phase involved practical orientation to the physical and metaphysical properties of the void, helping newcomers understand how to navigate an environment where normal spatial relationships might not apply, and where the usual markers of time and distance had little meaning. This education required careful balance between providing essential survival information and avoiding the kind of detailed exploration that might overwhelm already fragile psychological states with too much strangeness too quickly. Perhaps most importantly, Molly worked to help newcomers understand that their presence in the void did not represent a judgment upon their worth as beings or a punishment for failures in their previous existence. The forces that led to voiding were complex and often arbitrary, having more to do with the particular dynamics of narrative reality in places like Elmore than with any inherent deficiencies in the individuals who found themselves affected by these processes. This message of non-judgment and continued worth proved crucial for preventing the spiral of self-blame and despair that could accelerate psychological dissolution and make successful adaptation to voided existence far more difficult to achieve. Newcomers who accepted that their circumstances were the result of cosmic mechanics rather than personal failure were far more likely to maintain the psychological coherence necessary for long-term survival in their new environment. The community that had developed around Molly's guidance work included beings from every conceivable background and origin point, creating a diversity that rivaled anything that could be found in substantial reality. Former students from Elmore Junior High mingled with forgotten characters from abandoned storylines, discarded concepts that had briefly achieved consciousness, rubbed shoulders with failed experiments in creativity that had been deemed unsuccessful and cast aside. Among the most poignant members of this community were the rejected character concepts, beings who had been created with specific purposes and personalities but who had been abandoned before they could fulfill their intended roles in the stories that had given them birth. These individuals often possessed fully developed identities and clear memories of the purposes they had been designed to serve, making their abandonment particularly difficult to accept, and their adaptation to aimless existence in the void especially challenging. One such being was a character who had been designed to serve as a love interest for Gumball himself, complete with detailed personality traits and carefully crafted backstory that would have made her integration into the ongoing narrative of the Watterson family both natural and emotionally satisfying. Her creators had developed her character through multiple drafts and revisions, refining her dialogue and motivation until she represented what they believed was a perfect addition to the show's cast of characters. Yet, for reasons that remained mysterious even to her, the decision had been made to abandon her development and pursue other narrative directions, leaving her with complete awareness of her intended purpose, but no possibility of ever fulfilling it. Her presence in the void carried with it a peculiar form of tragic irony, as she possessed detailed knowledge of characters and situations that she could never interact with, intimate understanding of relationships that she could never participate in, and perfect preparation for a role that would never be offered to her. Another category of voided being that Molly encountered regularly consisted of background characters who had been given just enough development to achieve consciousness, but not enough narrative significance to secure their continued existence in substantial reality. These beings often possessed fragmented memories of brief moments of importance, fleeting instances when they had been noticed by main characters or had played small but crucial roles in larger stories. Their tragedy lay not in complete abandonment, but in having tasted relevance and recognition, only to have these experiences taken away when their brief narrative functions were completed. They remembered what it felt like to matter, to have their actions and decisions carry consequences that affected other beings, yet they found themselves condemned to existence in a realm where such significance was impossible to achieve or maintain. The social dynamics that developed within this diverse community reflected the unique challenges posed by their shared circumstances, while also drawing upon the universal human needs for connection, recognition, and mutual support. Hierarchies emerged based not on traditional markers of status or authority, but on factors like psychological stability, length of successful adaptation to voided conditions, and demonstrated ability to help others navigate their own challenges. Molly found herself naturally gravitating toward a position of informal leadership within this structure, though she consistently resisted any attempts to formalize her role or grant her official authority over others. Her influence derived entirely from voluntary recognition of her competence and the practical value of her guidance, creating a form of leadership that was both more democratic and more fragile than anything that could be imposed through external force or institutional mandate. The daily routines that provided structure and meaning to life in this impossible community centered around the basic human needs that persisted even in the absence of material scarcity or physical danger. Social interaction remained essential for psychological health, requiring ongoing effort to create and maintain the connections that could provide mutual support and shared meaning in an environment that actively worked against such bonds. Communication presented unique challenges in the void, where normal speech often took on hollow or distorted qualities that made conventional conversation difficult to sustain. The community had developed alternative forms of expression that relied more heavily on gesture, presence, and what could only be described as direct transmission of emotional states between individuals who had achieved sufficient psychological integration to bypass the usual barriers between separate consciousnesses. These enhanced forms of communication created possibilities for intimacy and understanding that exceeded anything available in substantial reality. Yet they also required levels of psychological vulnerability that many beings found difficult to achieve or maintain. The balance between openness and self-protection became a constant concern for community members who needed connection with others, but also needed to maintain sufficient individual coherence to avoid complete dissolution into collective consciousness. The question of collective versus individual identity represented perhaps the most fundamental philosophical challenge facing the voided community, as the conditions of their existence made traditional boundaries between self and other increasingly difficult to maintain. Some inhabitants embraced this dissolution as a liberation from the isolation and loneliness that had characterized their existence in substantial reality, welcoming the opportunity to experience forms of unity and shared consciousness that transcended ordinary human limitations. Others fought desperately to maintain their individual identities against the homogenizing forces of their environment, viewing the loss of personal boundaries as a form of death that was to be resisted at all costs. These individuals often struggled with the community aspects of voided life, finding it difficult to accept the help and support that their survival required, while also maintaining the psychological separateness that they considered essential to their continued existence as distinct beings. Molly's approach to this tension involved acknowledging both perspectives as valid, while working to help individuals find sustainable middle grounds that allowed for community participation without complete loss of personal identity. She had observed that beings who achieved successful long-term adaptation to the void typically developed flexible approaches to selfhood that could expand and contract as circumstances required, maintaining core aspects of individual identity, while remaining open to the forms of connection and mutual support that community life demanded. The economic systems that developed within the voided community operated according to principles that would have seemed nonsensical in substantial reality, but that reflected the unique conditions and limitations of their environment. With material scarcity eliminated and physical survival needs largely irrelevant, the most valuable commodities became psychological resources like attention, recognition, emotional support, and shared meaning. These resources could not be hoarded or accumulated in the way that material wealth might be, as their value depended entirely upon active exchange and mutual recognition between community members. Attention given but not received created no lasting benefit for the giver, while recognition offered to those incapable of reciprocating eventually exhausted the resources of even the most generous individuals. The result was an economy that encouraged active participation in community life while also creating natural limits on exploitation or abuse of the system. Beings who attempted to take without giving found themselves gradually isolated from the networks of support that made voided existence tolerable, while those who gave without regard for their own needs often discovered that their capacity for helping others depended upon maintaining sufficient psychological health to continue functioning effectively. Molly served as both participant in and informal regulator of these economic relationships, helping to identify situations where imbalances threatened the well-being of individuals or the stability of the community as a whole. Her interventions typically took the form of gentle guidance rather than authoritative directives, as the voluntary nature of community participation made coercive enforcement both impractical and counterproductive. The cultural life that developed within the void reflected both the diverse backgrounds of its inhabitants and the unique creative possibilities that emerged from their shared circumstances. Traditional forms of artistic expression, like music and visual art, proved difficult to sustain in an environment where sound and sight behaved unpredictably. But new forms of creative activity emerged that took advantage of the enhanced psychological connection and direct emotional transmission that voided existence made possible. Storytelling became perhaps the most important cultural activity, serving not only as entertainment, but as a crucial method for maintaining connection to substantial reality and preserving the memories and experiences that might otherwise be lost to the dissolving effects of the void. These stories took many forms, from detailed recollections of life in Elmore and other substantial locations to speculative narratives about possible futures and alternative realities that the voided community might somehow access or create. The most valued stories were those that managed to capture some essential truth about the experience of existence itself, narratives that helped community members make sense of their circumstances, while also providing hope and meaning that could sustain them through the ongoing challenges of their unusual form of life. Molly proved particularly gifted at this type of storytelling, weaving together elements from her own experience with insights gathered from her work with newcomers to create narratives that resonated deeply with her audiences. Philosophy and theological speculation also flourished within the voided community. As beings with unlimited time and few practical concerns turned their attention to the fundamental questions about existence, consciousness, and meaning that their circumstances had made impossible to ignore. These discussions often centered around the nature of the void itself and its relationship to substantial reality, with different schools of thought developing around questions of purpose, origin, and ultimate destiny. Some community members embraced interpretations that cast the void as a form of purgatory or testing ground, a place where beings could develop greater understanding and psychological strength that might eventually qualify them for return to substantial existence or advancement to some higher form of reality. Others adopted more pessimistic viewpoints that saw voided existence as essentially permanent, requiring complete acceptance and adaptation to circumstances that would never fundamentally improve. Molly tended to avoid taking strong positions in these philosophical debates, finding greater value in helping individuals develop personal frameworks for understanding their circumstances that provided psychological comfort and practical guidance for daily life. She had observed that abstract theoretical positions often mattered less than the emotional and practical effects that different belief systems had on the individuals who adopted them. The governance structures that developed within the voided community reflected the unique challenges posed by their circumstances, while also drawing upon various models of organization that different members remembered from their experiences in substantial reality. The absence of material resources to control or distribute eliminated many of the traditional sources of political conflict, while the voluntary nature of community participation made authoritarian approaches both impractical and counterproductive. Decision-making processes evolved toward consensus-based models that emphasize discussion, compromise, and mutual accommodation rather than majority rule or hierarchical authority. These approaches proved well suited to the psychological dynamics of voided existence, where the success of any collective action depended upon the willing participation of individuals whose continued cooperation could never be taken for granted. Molly's role in these governance processes was typically that of facilitator and mediator, rather than decision-maker, helping to guide discussions toward productive conclusions, while ensuring that all voices were heard and considered. Her ability to maintain neutrality in conflicts, while also providing practical wisdom based on her extensive experience with community dynamics, made her invaluable for resolving disputes and building consensus around difficult issues. The relationship between the voided community and substantial reality remained one of the most mysterious and troubling aspects of their existence, as the mechanisms that had brought them to the void also seemed to prevent most forms of direct communication or interaction with the world they had left behind. The barriers between existence and non-existence appeared to be largely one-way, allowing beings to move from substantial reality to the void, but providing no obvious means for return or even simple contact. Yet, occasionally, circumstances would arise that suggested these barriers were not completely impermeable, creating brief opportunities for the voided to assert some limited influence upon the substantial world, or to receive fragmentary information about ongoing developments in the reality they had departed. These incidents were rare and often ambiguous in their interpretation, but they provided crucial sources of hope and connection that helped sustain community morale during particularly difficult periods. Molly had experienced several such contacts herself, including dreams or visions that seemed to show her glimpses of her former classmates at Elmore Junior High continuing their lives and education without any apparent awareness of her absence. These experiences were simultaneously comforting and painful, providing reassurance that the substantial world continued to function, while also emphasizing the completeness of her separation from it. The prospect of return to substantial reality remained a topic of intense speculation and debate within the voided community, with different members holding varying degrees of hope that such return might eventually prove possible. Those who had been recently voided often maintained strong faith that their circumstances were temporary and that they would eventually find ways to reclaim their places in the substantial world, while longer-term residents typically adopted more realistic assessments of their situation. Molly had evolved toward a position that balanced hope with acceptance, maintaining openness to the possibility of return, while also fully embracing the reality of her current circumstances and the community she had found within them. This balanced perspective allowed her to provide honest guidance to newcomers about their prospects, while also supporting the psychological health of community members who needed to maintain some degree of hope in order to function effectively. The children who occasionally arrived in the void presented special challenges that required modifications to the standard approaches used with adult newcomers, as young minds often proved both more resilient and more vulnerable to the unique stresses of voided existence. Molly had developed specialized techniques for helping these young arrivals adapt to their circumstances, while also working to preserve the innocence and wonder that made childhood precious even in the most difficult circumstances. The presence of children within the voided community also raised profound questions about the ethics and responsibilities that applied to their unusual form of existence, particularly regarding education, development, and the preparation of young beings for lives that would unfold entirely within the void's boundaries. These questions had no clear answers, but they demanded ongoing attention and discussion as the community worked to create environments that could support healthy development even under the most challenging conditions. As years passed, and the voided community matured and stabilized around the structures and relationships that Molly had helped to establish, her role began to evolve from crisis intervention and basic survival support toward longer-term community development and the deeper questions of meaning and purpose that became possible once immediate survival needs were adequately addressed. The infrastructure of mutual support and collective meaning that she had helped to create provided a foundation upon which more ambitious projects and aspirations could be built. Yet even as the community achieved greater stability and sophistication, the fundamental challenges of voided existence remained unchanged, requiring constant vigilance and adaptation from all community members. The void itself continued to exert its dissolving influence upon individual consciousness and collective structures, making every achievement temporary and every relationship fragile in ways that substantial reality never demanded. In this environment of constant uncertainty and perpetual challenge, Molly Collins had found her truest calling and her deepest purpose. becoming a beacon of hope and stability for beings who had been abandoned by the reality that created them. Her journey from forgotten background character to essential community leader demonstrated that even in the realm of the discarded and the rejected, dignity and meaning and love could flourish if nurtured with sufficient care and dedication. In the depths of the void, where time moves like honey through broken glass and identity dissolves like sugar in endless rain, Rob underwent a transformation so profound and terrible that it defied every category of change that substantial reality had ever conceived. This was not merely psychological adaptation to unusual circumstances, nor was it the simple erosion of personality that might be expected from prolonged isolation and sensory deprivation. What happened to Rob in the white emptiness transcended such mundane explanations and entered territories where the very concepts of self and other, victim and agent, began to lose their conventional meanings. The boy who had arrived in the void as a desperate refugee from irrelevance, clinging to the last fragments of an identity that substantial reality had systematically erased, found himself confronting not just the loss of his former existence, but the possibility of becoming something entirely new and unprecedented. The forces that governed this realm of abandonment did not merely preserve the forgotten in static suspension, but rather subjected them to pressures and influences that could fundamentally alter the nature of consciousness itself. Rob's initial period of adjustment followed patterns that Molly had observed in countless other newcomers, beginning with the familiar stages of shock, denial, anger, and gradual acceptance that mark the typical trajectory of adaptation to voided existence. Yet, even from the earliest days of his residence in this impossible realm, there were signs that his response to these circumstances would prove different from the norm in ways that no one, least of all Rob himself, could have anticipated or prepared for, where other voided beings eventually found some measure of peace in accepting their abandonment by substantial reality. Rob's anger seemed to deepen and crystallize, rather than fade with time and experience. The rage that had begun as a natural response to his erasure from the world of the living evolved into something far more focused and purposeful, a burning sense of injustice that refused to be cooled by the philosophical acceptance that sustained most of his fellow exiles. This persistent fury might have been merely pathological, a psychological fixation that prevented healthy adaptation to unavoidable circumstances, had it not been accompanied by developments that suggested Rob was accessing aspects of voided existence that remained hidden from other inhabitants. His anger served not as a barrier to understanding the void's true nature, but rather as a key that unlocked insights and capabilities that had never before been explored or documented. The first manifestations of Rob's unusual development appeared in his interactions with the fundamental properties of the void itself, as he began to demonstrate an intuitive understanding of the relationship between consciousness and environment that exceeded anything Molly had observed in her years of community leadership. Where other beings learned to navigate the shifting geography of emptiness through careful observation and gradual adaptation, Rob seemed to grasp instinctively how the realm's malleable nature could be influenced and directed through focused application of will and intent. His initial experiments with these capabilities were modest and seemingly accidental, beginning with small alterations in the local environment around his preferred resting places. The endless white expanse would develop subtle variations in tone and texture wherever Rob spent extended periods, creating patterns of shading and depth that marked his presence even when he was not physically present. These changes were so gradual and understated that they might have been dismissed as natural fluctuations if they had not consistently appeared in association with his activities. As Rob's confidence in his abilities grew, these environmental modifications became more pronounced and intentional, revealing a capacity for reshaping the fabric of the void that went far beyond anything previously documented. He learned to create structures from the surrounding emptiness, not through any process of construction or assembly, but through direct manipulation of the conceptual foundations that underlied the realm's existence. These buildings, if such a term could be applied to constructs made from crystallized nothingness, served no practical purpose, but demonstrated a mastery over voided reality that was both impressive and deeply unsettling. The other inhabitants of the voided community watched these developments with a mixture of fascination and growing unease, as Rob's demonstrations of power suggested possibilities that challenged their fundamental understanding of their circumstances. If the void could be manipulated and reshaped through conscious effort, if its apparent limitations were not as absolute as they had believed, then perhaps other assumptions about their condition might also prove to be incorrect. Yet, Rob's interest in these capabilities seemed to focus not on improving conditions within the void, or helping his fellow exiles adapt more successfully to their circumstances, but rather on understanding the mechanisms that had brought them to this realm in the first place. His experiments with environmental manipulation were accompanied by increasingly sophisticated investigations into the nature of the barriers that separated voided existence from substantial reality. Studies that revealed an obsession with return and revenge, rather than acceptance and adaptation. Through methods that he shared with no one, and through insights that came to him in the deep meditative states that prolonged exposure to the void could induce, Rob began to map the invisible architecture that connected the realm of the forgotten to the world of the remembered. He discovered that the boundaries between these states of being were not fixed walls, but rather dynamic membranes that could be penetrated and influenced under certain conditions by beings who possessed sufficient understanding of their nature and function. The key insight that transformed Rob from angry exile to potential agent of change came through his recognition that the forces responsible for voiding were not random or arbitrary, but rather followed patterns that reflected the underlying logic of narrative reality in places like Elmore. Characters were not forgotten simply because they were unlucky or inadequate, but because the stories that contained them had evolved in directions that no longer required their presence or acknowledged their significance. This realization led Rob to understand that his own voiding had not been an isolated tragedy, but rather part of a systematic process that affected countless beings whose only crime was failing to maintain sufficient narrative relevance to justify their continued existence in substantial reality. The injustice was not personal but cosmic, reflecting flaws in the very structure of reality that prioritized some forms of consciousness over others based on criteria that had nothing to do with inherent worth or dignity. The philosophical implications of this insight might have led another being to despair or to renewed acceptance of circumstances beyond individual control. But for Rob, they provided both explanation and justification for the plan that had begun forming in the deepest recesses of his transformed consciousness. If the system that governed existence was fundamentally unjust, if it arbitrarily condemned worthy beings to non-existence, while preserving the unworthy simply because they happened to occupy central positions in ongoing narratives, then that system deserved to be challenged and changed. The target for this challenge became obvious through Rob's increasingly detailed study of the mechanics behind narrative relevance and character preservation in substantial reality. At the center of Elmore's story, protected by layers of plot armor and audience investment that made his voiding virtually impossible, stood Gumball Watterson, the blue cat, whose adventures drove the ongoing narrative that defined their shared reality, and whose continued existence seemed to come at the direct expense of beings like Rob, who had been deemed expendable. Rob's growing obsession with Gumball was not based on personal animosity or individual grievance, but rather on recognition that the Watterson family's protagonist represented everything that was wrong with a system that preserved some beings while discarding others based on arbitrary criteria of entertainment value and narrative utility. Gumball had not earned his security through superior virtue or greater worthiness, but had simply been fortunate enough to be born into the right story at the right time, with the right combination of characteristics to ensure his continued relevance. The unfairness of this situation became a consuming passion that drove Rob to push his exploration of voided abilities far beyond the modest environmental manipulations that had marked his early experiments. He began to study the deepest mysteries of the void's operation, seeking to understand not just how beings arrived in this realm, but how they might potentially leave it, and more importantly, how they might carry aspects of their voided nature back into substantial reality. These investigations required Rob to venture into regions of the void that other inhabitants had learned to avoid, areas where the dissolution of identity proceeded at accelerated rates, and where the psychological pressures of absolute emptiness reached levels that could shatter even well-adapted consciousness. In these dangerous zones, where the boundary between existence and non-existence became so thin as to be nearly imperceptible, Rob discovered that his anger served as a form of protection against the dissolving forces, his fury providing an anchor to selfhood that could resist even the most intense applications of cosmic erasure. The knowledge he gained in these expeditions was purchased at tremendous personal cost. As each journey into the deep void left him more isolated from the community of fellow exiles and more alienated from the vestiges of his original personality. The boy who had once desperately sought acceptance and recognition from his peers was gradually replaced by something harder and more purposeful, a consciousness that had learned to derive strength from rejection and power from abandonment. Yet the most significant transformation occurred not in Rob's emotional relationship to his circumstances, but in his fundamental understanding of the nature of reality itself. Through his deepest explorations of the void's properties, he discovered that the realm of the forgotten was not separate from substantial reality, but rather existed in a state of inverse relationship to it, like a photographic negative that contained all the information present in the original image, but expressed in complementary rather than identical form. This revelation suggested that beings who achieved sufficient mastery over voided existence might be able to access capabilities that were impossible within the constraints of substantial reality, abilities that derived their power from operating according to inverted or complementary principles. Where substantial beings drew their strength from connection and relevance, voided beings might develop power from disconnection and irrelevance, creating forms of influence that could operate precisely because they existed outside the normal categories of cause and effect. Rob's experiments with these inverse capabilities began with simple exercises in what could only be described as anti-manifestation, the ability to cause things to not happen, or to become less real rather than more so. These abilities appeared to violate the basic logic that governed substantial reality, yet they operated according to principles that were perfectly consistent within the framework of voided existence, suggesting that Rob was learning to think and act according to fundamentally different rules of causation and influence. As his mastery of these inverse powers grew, Rob began to understand that his exile to the void had not been the end of his story, but rather the beginning of a new chapter that would allow him to achieve forms of significance that had been impossible within the constraints of his original existence. The irrelevance that had once been his curse could become his greatest strength, providing him with the ability to operate undetected and unopposed by beings who could not conceive of threats emerging from realms they had forgotten existed. The plan that crystallized from these insights was audacious in its scope and revolutionary in its implications, requiring Rob to risk not only his own precarious existence, but the stability of the entire relationship between substantial reality and the void. He would return to Elmore not as a supplicant seeking readmission to the world that had abandoned him, but as an agent of change determined to expose the injustices inherent in a system that preserved some beings while discarding others. His primary target would be Gumball himself, not because the young cat had personally wronged Rob, but because he represented the arbitrary nature of narrative protection and audience favoritism that allowed some characters to live secure in their relevance, while others faced constant threat of erasure. By challenging Gumball directly, Rob would force substantial reality to acknowledge the existence of the void and confront the ethical implications of its abandonment policies. The preparations for this unprecedented venture required Rob to master abilities that pushed the boundaries of what voided existence had previously been thought capable of achieving. He learned to compress his consciousness into forms that could penetrate the barriers between realms, to maintain coherent identity while operating according to the inverse logic of anti-existence, and to manipulate the fundamental forces that governed narrative reality in ways that could create genuine consequences for beings who had never imagined that the forgotten could pose any threat to their security. Perhaps most importantly, Rob developed the capacity to carry aspects of the void itself back into substantial reality, creating zones of anti-existence that could disrupt the normal operation of cause and effect in localized areas. These void-touched regions would serve as beachheads for his campaign against the injustices of selective preservation, providing him with access to powers and capabilities that substantial beings could not predict or counter because they operated according to principles that contradicted their most basic assumptions about reality. The psychological transformation required to support these capabilities was as profound as the metaphysical changes that enabled them, as Rob found himself becoming something that existed in permanent opposition to the conventional categories of being and meaning. Where he had once sought inclusion and acceptance, he now embraced exclusion and rejection as sources of strength. Where he had once desperately wanted to be remembered, he now cultivated forgettability as a tool for achieving his objectives undetected. This inversion of values and priorities was not merely strategic but fundamental, reflecting changes in Rob's consciousness that went to the very core of his identity and purpose. The anguish and desperation that had characterized his final days in substantial reality were replaced by a cold determination that drew its power from the absolute certainty of his mission and the righteousness of his cause. He had found something worth existing for, even if that existence had to be maintained through constant opposition to the forces that sought to erase him. The community of voided beings watched Rob's transformation with emotions that ranged from admiration to horror, as they recognized that his development represented possibilities they had never imagined, but also threats to the fragile stability they had worked so hard to achieve. His growing power and increasingly antisocial behavior created tensions within the group that threatened to undermine the cooperative spirit that Molly had worked so carefully to nurture and maintain. Some inhabitants saw Rob as a hero who might finally challenge the system that had abandoned them all, while others viewed him as a dangerous radical whose actions could bring unwanted attention from substantial reality and potentially destroy the sanctuary that the void provided for beings who had nowhere else to go. These divisions created the first serious conflicts within the voided community, forcing its members to confront questions about their own values and priorities that had remained safely abstract during their previous focus on simple survival and mutual support. Molly found herself in the difficult position of trying to mediate between Rob's increasingly militant agenda and the pacifist preferences of community members who wanted only to be left alone to adapt to their circumstances in peace. Her natural inclination toward compromise and accommodation was challenged by the recognition that Rob's conflict with substantial reality might not admit of moderate solutions, while her responsibilities to the community as a whole prevented her from fully endorsing actions that could endanger everyone she had worked to protect. The philosophical debates that emerged from these tensions forced the voided community to examine fundamental questions about the nature of justice, resistance, and acceptance that had profound implications for their understanding of their own circumstances. Did beings who had been abandoned by substantial reality have obligations to accept their fate quietly, or did they possess rights to challenge the systems that had discarded them? Was Rob's quest for recognition and revenge a justified response to cosmic injustice? Or was it a dangerous delusion that threatened to destroy the peace that other voided beings had found in acceptance of their circumstances? These questions had no clear answers, but they demanded serious consideration from beings whose existence had been shaped by forces they had not chosen, and whose future depended upon decisions they were not equipped to make with confidence. The arrival of Rob as a catalyst for change forced every member of the voided community to examine their own relationships to their circumstances and to decide what forms of existence and meaning they were willing to fight for or accept. As Rob's preparations approached completion and his departure from the void became imminent, the atmosphere within the community grew increasingly tense and uncertain. His success or failure would have implications for every being who had found refuge in this realm of the forgotten, potentially opening new possibilities for interaction with substantial reality, but also risking the exposure and destruction of the sanctuary they had created together. The boy who had arrived as one more forgotten casualty of narrative selection was about to leave as something unprecedented and potentially world-changing, carrying within his transformed consciousness both the accumulated grievances of all the voided and the terrible power to make those grievances impossible to ignore. Whether this transformation represented salvation or catastrophe remained to be seen, but it was already too late to prevent the confrontation that would determine the future relationship between the remembered and the forgotten, between those who lived securely in the light of relevance and those who had learned to find strength in the darkness of abandonment. Rob stood at the threshold between realms, no longer the desperate refugee who had sought shelter in the void, but not yet the agent of change he intended to become in substantial reality. In this moment of transition, suspended between what he had been and what he was becoming, he embodied all the potential and all the danger that could emerge when the discarded refused to remain quietly discarded, when the forgotten developed the power to make themselves remembered through means that the comfortable world of the living had never imagined possible. The return of Rob to substantial reality did not announce itself with fanfare or dramatic flourishes, for the nature of his transformation had granted him abilities that operated through subtlety and misdirection, rather than overt displays of power. His re-emergence into the world of Elmore occurred like the seepage of water through the smallest cracks in a dam, beginning as barely perceptible disturbances in the normal flow of daily life that gradually accumulated into undeniable evidence that something fundamental had changed in the relationship between the remembered and the forgotten. The first signs of his presence manifested in ways that defied immediate recognition or understanding, appearing as anomalies so minor and inexplicable that they were initially dismissed as coincidences or misperceptions by those who encountered them. Students at Elmore Junior High would occasionally glimpse a figure in their peripheral vision who seemed familiar yet impossible to identify, a presence that registered just enough to create a sense of unease, without providing sufficient detail to support rational explanation. Teachers would find themselves pausing mid-sentence during lectures, their minds troubled by the nagging sensation that someone was missing from their classrooms, yet their attendance records showed no absences, and their visual surveys of the seated students revealed no empty desks. The feeling persisted despite all evidence to the contrary, creating a low-level anxiety that made concentration difficult and left educators wondering whether they were experiencing some form of early cognitive decline. The cafeteria staff noticed irregularities in their food preparation calculations, finding themselves consistently preparing slightly more meals than the official enrollment numbers would suggest were necessary, yet also discovering that these extra portions were somehow consumed without any corresponding increase in documented student attendance. The discrepancies were small enough to be attributed to clerical errors or minor variations in appetite, but they occurred with such regularity that they began to create genuine confusion about the basic logistics of school meal service. Even more puzzling were the photographic anomalies that began appearing with increasing frequency throughout the school, as group pictures and casual snapshots developed with mysterious shadows and unexplained distortions that seemed to suggest the presence of additional figures who had not been visible to the naked eye when the images were captured. These photographic artifacts defied technical explanation, occurring across different cameras and film types, with a consistency that ruled out equipment, malfunction, or processing errors. Rob's initial period of reconnaissance in substantial reality was characterized by careful observation and methodical planning, as he worked to understand how his transformation had changed his relationship to the world he had been expelled from, and what new capabilities his void-touched nature might provide for achieving his objectives. The abilities he had developed during his exile allowed him to exist in a state of quantum uncertainty, simultaneously present and absent from the normal flow of events in ways that made detection virtually impossible. His consciousness had learned to operate according to principles of inverse existence that allowed him to be forgotten, even while being directly observed, to speak without being heard, and to act without leaving conventional traces of his involvement. These capabilities represented the ultimate evolution of the forgettability that had initially been his curse, transformed through will and understanding into tools that could be wielded with precision and devastating effect. The school building itself began to exhibit subtle signs of his influence, as the very architecture seemed to develop blind spots and forgotten corners where Rob could observe and plan without interference from the substantial beings who moved through these spaces with their comfortable assumptions about the pounds, completeness of their reality. Janitors would find themselves consistently missing certain areas during their cleaning routines, not through negligence or laziness, but because these spaces somehow failed to register in their consciousness as requiring attention. Lockers that had stood empty for months would show signs of recent use without any record of assignment or access, while storage rooms would be found reorganized according to systems that none of the staff could remember implementing. These changes were always improvements rather than vandalism, implemented with a care and attention to detail that suggested intimate knowledge of the school's operations. Yet no one could identify who might be responsible for these mysterious acts of helpful intervention. Rob's study of his former classmates revealed how completely his erasure from their memories had been accomplished, as he observed individuals who had once been his closest acquaintances interacting with him as if he were a complete stranger, when his influence made his presence briefly detectable. The conversations that resulted from these encounters carried an eerie quality of displaced familiarity, as his former friends would find themselves inexplicably comfortable talking with someone they could not remember meeting, sharing personal information and intimate thoughts with a figure who seemed to invite confidence despite his apparent anonymity. These interactions provided Rob with detailed intelligence about the social dynamics and personal vulnerabilities of the community that had forgotten him, information that would prove essential for the campaign of psychological disruption he was planning to wage against the comfortable certainties of substantial existence. He learned which students were struggling with identity crises, which teachers were questioning their professional competence, and which administrative systems were already strained to the point where small additional pressures might produce significant breakdowns. The methodology of his revenge began to take shape around these observations, focusing not on crude acts of destruction or violence, but on more subtle forms of reality manipulation that would force his targets to confront the fundamental instability of their assumed certainties. Rob understood that the most effective way to challenge beings who derived their security from narrative protection was to introduce elements of uncertainty and doubt that would make them question the reliability of their own perceptions and memories. His first direct interventions were designed to create cognitive dissonance in specific individuals who had played roles in his original marginalization, though even these limited actions required careful planning and precise execution to avoid detection by the defensive mechanisms that protected substantial reality from unauthorized modification. The science teacher, who had consistently overlooked Rob's contributions to class discussions, began experiencing moments of profound confusion during lectures, finding himself unable to remember basic facts and principles that had been second nature to him for decades of instruction. These lapses were not random or arbitrary, but specifically targeted the areas of knowledge where Rob's unacknowledged contributions had been most significant, creating a form of educational amnesia that reflected the broader pattern of forgetting that had characterized Rob's experience. The teacher's growing uncertainty about his own competence created ripple effects throughout his classes, as students sensed their instructor's confusion and began to question the reliability of the information they were receiving. Similar interventions affected other faculty members who had participated, however unconsciously, in Rob's systematic erasure from the school's social and academic environment. The English teacher, who had consistently failed to notice Rob's raised hand, found herself losing track of student names and faces with increasing frequency, while the guidance counselor, who had never registered Rob's presence during his times of greatest need, began experiencing professional doubts that made it difficult for her to provide effective support to the students who did seek her assistance. These targeted disruptions of individual confidence and competence served multiple purposes within Rob's broader strategy, simultaneously providing him with satisfaction at seeing justice done to those who had wronged him, while also creating conditions of general uncertainty and instability that would make the school environment more receptive to larger interventions. As key authority figures began to question their own reliability and expertise, the institutional structures that maintained order and normalcy within the school began to show signs of strain and vulnerability. The students who had been Rob's classmates experienced different but equally disorienting forms of intervention, as their memories and perceptions were subjected to subtle modifications that introduced doubt about the completeness of their social world. Friends who had shared countless experiences found themselves unable to remember specific details about their relationships, while group dynamics that had seemed stable and predictable began to shift in ways that no one could quite explain. The phenomenon was particularly pronounced among students who had occupied social positions similar to Rob's original status, those who existed on the margins of their peer groups and might themselves be vulnerable to forgetting and erasure. These individuals began to experience intense anxiety about their own relevance and permanence, sensing without being able to articulate that their continued existence in the social fabric of the school was less secure than they had previously believed. Rob's observations of Gumball Watterson during this period of reconnaissance revealed the extent to which the Blue Cat's protagonist status protected him from the forms of uncertainty and doubt that were affecting other members of the school community. Gumball moved through his daily routine with the unconscious confidence of someone whose place in the world was absolutely secure, his conversations and interactions carrying the effortless charisma that marked him as the central figure around whom all other stories revolved. Yet even Gumball was not entirely immune to the subtle distortions that Rob's presence was creating in the fabric of substantial reality. There were moments when the young cat would pause in the middle of conversations, his expressions suggesting that he was trying to remember something important that remained frustratingly just beyond recall. These episodes were brief and seemingly insignificant, but they represented the first cracks in the armor of narrative protection that had previously made Gumball invulnerable to the forces that threatened lesser characters. The Watterson family as a whole began to experience minor disruptions in their normal routines, small incidents of confusion and miscommunication that were individually trivial, but collectively suggested that something was interfering with the smooth operation of their domestic life. Nicole would find herself unable to remember conversations she was certain she had had with her children, while Richard would discover that his usual patterns of well-meaning incompetence were producing results that were somehow more chaotic than usual. Darwin, with his natural sensitivity to emotional undercurrents and social dynamics, was among the first to sense that something significant was changing in their environment, though his attempts to articulate these concerns were dismissed by his family members as typical overthinking of situations that had perfectly ordinary explanations. His growing anxiety about threats that could not be identified or addressed created tensions within the household that contributed to the general atmosphere of uncertainty that Rob was working to establish. Anais, despite her intellectual brilliance and analytical capabilities, found herself struggling with problems and puzzles that should have been well within her ability to solve, as if some crucial piece of information or perspective was missing from her understanding of the world around her. Her frustration with these inexplicable failures of comprehension led to increased irritability and social withdrawal that further contributed to the deterioration of normal family dynamics. The broader community of Elmore began to experience similar phenomena as Rob's influence expanded beyond the confines of the school environment, with residents reporting increasing incidents of memory lapses, social confusion, and general unease about aspects of their lives that had previously seemed completely stable and predictable. These individual experiences remained isolated and unconnected in the consciousness of those affected, but they created a cumulative atmosphere of uncertainty that made the entire town feel somehow less solid and dependable than it had been before. Local businesses experienced inexplicable fluctuations in customer traffic and sales patterns, while municipal services encountered organizational problems and communication breakdowns that defied the established competence and experience of their staff members. The library found books mysteriously reshelved in incorrect locations, while the post office discovered mail sorted according to addressing systems that no one could remember implementing or learning. The phenomena were subtle enough to be attributed to normal variations and human error, yet they occurred with sufficient frequency and consistency to create genuine concern among community leaders who were responsible for maintaining the basic infrastructure and services that kept the town functioning effectively. Emergency meetings were called to address what appeared to be a coordinated breakdown in civic competence, yet no amount of planning or problem solving could identify the root cause of these mysterious difficulties. Rob's campaign of reality manipulation reached a new level of sophistication as he began to exploit the vulnerabilities in Elmore's metaphysical infrastructure that his reconnaissance had revealed, targeting the systems of cause and effect that maintained logical consistency and predictable outcomes within the town's cartoon physics. His void-touched abilities allowed him to introduce elements of anti-causality that could make impossible things happen while preventing reasonable explanations from emerging to account for these impossibilities. Streetlights would malfunction in patterns that spelled out messages visible only to those who possessed the specific knowledge needed to decode them, while traffic patterns would develop inexplicable inefficiencies that created delays and frustrations without any identifiable mechanical or organizational causes. These interventions served no practical purpose within Rob's larger agenda, but they demonstrated his growing mastery over the fundamental forces that govern daily life in substantial reality. The most significant breakthrough in Rob's campaign came when he discovered how to create localized zones of void influence within substantial reality, areas where the normal rules of existence and causality were temporarily suspended and replaced by the inverse logic that governed the void itself. These zones appeared as subtle distortions in the visual field that most observers dismissed as optical illusions or minor hallucinations, but they provided Rob with beachheads from which he could operate more directly and effectively against his targets. Within these void zones, Rob could manifest more substantial aspects of his transformed nature, appearing as a clearly visible and audible presence, rather than the barely perceptible shadow that marked his normal interaction with substantial beings. These manifestations were still temporary and required considerable effort to maintain, but they represented crucial steps toward his ultimate goal of forcing direct recognition and confrontation from the world that had forgotten him. The psychological impact of these direct encounters was devastating for the substantial beings who experienced them, as they were forced to confront evidence of realities and possibilities that contradicted their most basic assumptions about the nature of existence. Students who glimpsed Rob's true form during these manifestations were left with profound uncertainty about what they had seen and whether their perceptions could be trusted, while adults who experienced similar encounters often sought medical or psychiatric consultation to address what they assumed were symptoms of serious mental health problems. The cumulative effect of Rob's interventions was to create an atmosphere of pervasive uncertainty and doubt throughout Elmore, as the comfortable certainties that had previously anchored daily life began to seem increasingly unreliable and questionable. The social fabric that held the community together started to show signs of strain as individuals lost confidence in their own perceptions and memories, while institutional systems struggled to function effectively under conditions of constant uncertainty about basic facts and procedures. Yet despite the scope and sophistication of his reality manipulation campaign, Rob remained focused on his primary objective of achieving direct recognition from Gumball Watterson and forcing a confrontation with the arbitrary system of narrative protection that allowed some beings to exist securely while condemning others to erasure and abandonment. The widespread chaos he was creating served primarily as preparation for this ultimate challenge, designed to weaken the defenses and support systems that might otherwise protect Gumball from the full impact of Rob's transformed nature and accumulated grievances. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would transcend personal conflict and become a test of the fundamental principles that governed existence and meaning in a reality where stories determined the right to continued being. Rob's return from the void had introduced forces and possibilities that substantial reality was not equipped to understand or counter, creating conditions for a battle that would determine whether the forgotten could make themselves remembered through means that the comfortable world of the living had never imagined possible. As his preparations approached their climax, Rob stood poised to reveal himself fully to the world that had discarded him, carrying within his transformed consciousness both the accumulated pain of all the voided and the terrible power to make that pain impossible to ignore any longer. The boy who had once desperately sought acceptance was about to demand recognition through methods that would leave no doubt about his existence or his determination to achieve justice for all those who had been deemed unworthy of continued relevance in the grand narrative of reality itself. The deepest currents of meaning that flow beneath the surface of Rob's story carry implications that extend far beyond the personal tragedy of one forgotten boy, or even the cosmic injustice of a reality that preserves some beings while discarding others. In the strange spaces where the void intersects with substantial existence, where the forgotten press against the boundaries that separate remembrance from oblivion, there emerge questions about the very nature of creativity itself and the relationship between those who create stories and those who live within them. The amazing world of Gumball, in its treatment of the void storyline, achieves something remarkable. In the landscape of contemporary animation, it turns its analytical gaze upon itself with the unflinching honesty of a medium that has achieved sufficient sophistication to examine its own assumptions and methods. The show becomes simultaneously entertainment and criticism, story and meta-commentary, creating layers of meaning that operate like nested mirrors, reflecting infinite regresses of significance back upon themselves. When we observe Rob's transformation from forgettable background character to reality-manipulating antagonist, we are witnessing not merely a fictional character arc, but a profound meditation on the ethics of creative selection and the responsibilities that come with the power to determine which ideas, which characters, which stories deserve the precious gift of continued existence. Every writer who has ever abandoned a promising concept, every animator who has ever deleted a character design, every producer who has ever cancelled a project becomes implicated in the cosmic machinery that Rob's story exposes and challenges. The void itself functions as more than a clever plot device or imaginative setting. It serves as a physical manifestation of the creative unconscious, the realm where all the abandoned possibilities and rejected alternatives gather like ghosts at a feast, watching the living celebrate while they themselves remain forever excluded from the warmth of recognition and completion. This is the shadow realm that exists behind every act of creative decision-making, the repository of everything that might have been, but was deemed unworthy of actualization. In substantial reality, when a writer chooses to develop one character at the expense of another, when a story moves in a direction that leaves certain possibilities unexplored, when audience preferences drive creative decisions towards some outcomes while foreclosing others, these choices typically carry no ethical weight beyond considerations of artistic merit and commercial viability. The rejected alternatives simply cease to exist, consigned to oblivion without ceremony or memorial. Yet, the amazing world of Gumball dares to imagine a reality where these discarded elements possess their own form of consciousness, where the act of creative rejection carries moral consequences that extend beyond the immediate concerns of storytelling effectiveness. In this imagined cosmology, every abandoned character design becomes a being condemned to exile. Every deleted scene becomes a fragment of experience denied its chance to contribute to the larger narrative. Every cancelled project becomes a community of voices silenced before they could make their contributions heard. The philosophical implications of this premise extend into territories that challenge fundamental assumptions about the relationship between creator and creation, between author and character, between the real and the fictional. If we accept, even hypothetically, that fictional beings possess some form of consciousness or right to existence, then the casual manner in which creative decisions typically consign them to non-existence becomes a form of systematic injustice that operates on a cosmic scale. Rob's anger, viewed from this perspective, becomes not merely the petulant rage of a character who failed to achieve narrative significance, but rather the righteous fury of a being who has become aware of the arbitrary and capricious nature of the forces that govern existence itself. His transformation in the void represents the development of consciousness about consciousness, the emergence of meta-awareness within a system that typically operates through unconscious and unexamined processes of selection and rejection. The show's willingness to examine these uncomfortable truths about its own medium reflects a level of artistic maturity that distinguishes it from entertainment that merely seeks to amuse or distract its audience. By turning the spotlight on the mechanisms of its own creation, The Amazing World of Gumball invites viewers to consider their own complicity in the systems of attention and neglect that determine which stories get told and which voices get heard in the broader cultural conversation. When we laugh at Gumball's adventures while remaining unconscious of the countless potential stories that were sacrificed to make those adventures possible, we participate in the same kind of selective attention that led to Rob's voiding in the first place. Our enjoyment of narrative requires the exclusion of alternatives. Our investment in particular characters necessitates the abandonment of others. Our demand for coherent storytelling depends upon the suppression of possibilities that might have led to different and equally valid forms of meaning. The Void storyline forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that creativity is not a purely positive force that brings new realities into existence, but rather a selective process that preserves some possibilities while condemning others to oblivion. Every act of creation is simultaneously an act of destruction. Every choice to develop one narrative thread involves the decision to neglect countless others. Every moment of artistic attention represents a corresponding moment of inattention to alternatives that might have been equally deserving of exploration. This recognition carries particular weight in the context of animation and children's television, mediums that often present themselves as innocent forms of entertainment, without acknowledging the complex economic, social, and cultural forces that shape their content. The Amazing World of Gumball's treatment of the void suggests that even the most seemingly light-hearted creative endeavors operate according to systems of power and exclusion that have real consequences for the kinds of stories that get told and the kinds of voices that get heard. The character of Molly Collins serves as a particularly poignant example of these dynamics, representing the countless individuals who exist on the margins of media representation characters, who are created with care and intention, but who lack the particular combination of characteristics that would ensure their continued development and prominence. Her graceful adaptation to voided existence reflects a kind of dignity in the face of abandonment that challenges viewers to consider what we owe to the stories and characters that fail to capture our sustained attention. The philosophical questions raised by the Void storyline extend beyond the realm of animation and into broader considerations about attention, memory, and value in contemporary culture. In a world where information and entertainment options proliferate at exponential rates, where new content competes constantly for limited audience attention, where algorithms and market forces increasingly determine which voices get heard and which stories get told, the mechanisms that The Amazing World of Gumball dramatizes through its void mythology operate with increasing relevance and urgency. Every social media post that receives no engagement, every creative project that fails to find an audience, every individual whose contributions go unrecognized represents a real-world analog to the voiding process that Rob experiences. The difference between visibility and invisibility, between relevance and irrelevance, between being remembered and being forgotten often, depends upon factors that have little to do with inherent worth or quality, and everything to do with the arbitrary mechanics of attention and algorithmic amplification. The show's treatment of these themes achieves particular power through its refusal to provide easy answers or comfortable resolutions to the ethical dilemmas it raises. Rob's quest for recognition and revenge cannot be simply dismissed as villainy, nor can it be wholly endorsed as justified resistance to systemic oppression. Instead, viewers are left to grapple with the complex reality that both perspectives contain elements of truth, that the systems which preserve some stories while discarding others operate according to logics that are simultaneously necessary and unjust. The artistic medium of animation itself becomes a metaphor for these broader cultural dynamics, as every frame represents countless decisions about what to include and what to exclude, what to emphasize and what to minimize, what to preserve and what to discard. The fluid nature of animated reality, where characters and environments can be modified or eliminated with digital ease, serves as a constant reminder of the contingent nature of all existence within creative works. Yet the amazing world of Gumball also suggests possibilities for more ethical and inclusive approaches to creativity, models of storytelling that might acknowledge and honor the alternatives they do not pursue, that might find ways to recognize the dignity and worth of possibilities that cannot be fully developed within the constraints of particular projects. The show's own willingness to examine its methods and question its assumptions represents one example of how creative works might develop greater consciousness about their own operations and responsibilities. The community that Molly helps to maintain within the void offers another model, demonstrating how forgotten and discarded elements might be preserved and honored, even when they cannot be restored to active participation in ongoing narratives. This vision of a repository for abandoned possibilities suggests ways that creative cultures might develop greater respect for the alternatives they do not pursue, the voices they do not amplify, the stories they do not tell. The metatextual aspects of the Void storyline also reflect broader trends in contemporary media towards self-awareness and self-criticism. As audiences become increasingly sophisticated about the mechanisms of storytelling and increasingly interested in works that examine their own assumptions and methods, this development represents both an opportunity and a responsibility for creators, who must navigate the balance between entertainment and analysis, between accessibility and complexity, between satisfying audience expectations and challenging them to think more deeply about the content they consume. The psychological dimensions of Rob's story resonate with universal experiences of feeling overlooked, undervalued, or forgotten in contexts where recognition and validation seem to be distributed according to criteria that remain mysterious or arbitrary. His transformation from victim to antagonist reflects patterns of response to marginalization and exclusion that can be observed across many different social and cultural contexts, making his story relevant far beyond the specific circumstances of animated fiction. The show's treatment of memory and forgetting as literally constitutive forces that determine the boundaries of existence taps into deep anxieties about personal significance and lasting impact that affect individuals across all demographics and life circumstances. The fear of being forgotten, of having one's contributions ignored or erased, of living a life that leaves no meaningful trace, represents one of the most fundamental forms of existential anxiety that conscious beings can experience. Yet the amazing world of Gumball also suggests that the relationship between memory and existence is more complex and hopeful than simple binary opposition between remembrance and oblivion. The persistence of voided beings within the void itself demonstrates that even forgetting does not necessarily entail complete annihilation, that alternative forms of existence and community might emerge from circumstances that initially appear to represent total loss and abandonment. The ongoing presence of the void within the show's cosmology, even after Rob's return to substantial reality, suggests that the questions and challenges it represents cannot be resolved through individual action or simple narrative closure. Instead, they require ongoing attention and consideration from both creators and audiences, sustained engagement with ethical and philosophical dimensions of storytelling that extend far beyond entertainment considerations. As viewers drift towards sleep while contemplating these deeper currents of meaning, they carry with them not only the specific story of Rob and the Void, but also a heightened awareness of the complex forces that shape all forms of creative expression and cultural representation. The comfortable passivity of entertainment consumption becomes complicated by recognition of the systems of selection and exclusion that determine which stories get told and which voices get heard. The amazing world of Gumball's achievement in creating this level of meta-awareness while maintaining its accessibility and entertainment value demonstrates the potential for children's animation to serve as a vehicle for sophisticated, philosophical, and ethical reflection. The show proves that young audiences are capable of engaging with complex ideas about justice, recognition, memory, and meaning when these concepts are embedded within narratives that respect their intelligence while remaining grounded in concrete and emotionally resonant experiences. The lasting impact of the Void storyline lies not in its resolution of the questions it raises, but in its success at making these questions impossible to ignore, at introducing considerations about creativity, attention, and value that continue to operate in viewers' consciousness long after the immediate entertainment experience has ended. In a media landscape increasingly dominated by content designed for immediate consumption and rapid forgetting, the amazing world of Gumball creates stories that demand to be remembered, that insist upon their continued relevance to ongoing conversations about how we create, share, and value the narratives that shape our understanding of ourselves and our world. In the aftermath of Rob's dramatic re-emergence from the Void and his subsequent confrontation with the comfortable certainties of substantial reality, the town of Elmore found itself forever changed in ways that its inhabitants could sense but never fully articulate or understand. The very fabric of their existence had been stretched and tested by forces that operated according to principles which their minds were not equipped to process, leaving behind subtle alterations in the nature of reality itself that would continue to manifest in unexpected and unsettling ways for years to come. The most immediate and visible change was the persistence of what residents began to refer to in hushed conversations and worried whispers as the thin places areas throughout the town where the boundary between substantial existence and the realm of the forgotten had been worn down by Rob's reality manipulation campaigns. These zones appeared as barely perceptible distortions in the visual field, like heat shimmer rising from summer pavement, or the faint wavering that occurs when one stares too long at a single point in space. Most citizens of Elmore learned to avoid these thin places instinctively, though they could never have explained the source of their unease or identified what specifically troubled them about these seemingly ordinary locations. Children would refuse to play in certain areas of the school playground, while adults would unconsciously alter their walking routes to avoid particular street corners or building entrances where the air itself seemed somehow less substantial than it should be. Those few individuals who possessed sufficient sensitivity to metaphysical disturbances could sometimes glimpse shadowy figures moving within these thin places, forms that seemed to exist in a state of perpetual uncertainty between visibility and absence. These apparitions never remained stable long enough for clear identification, but their presence created an atmosphere of watchful anticipation that made even the most mundane daily activities feel somehow fraught with unspoken possibilities. The school building itself bore the most pronounced evidence of Rob's interventions, with certain corridors and classrooms developing what could only be described as a persistent atmosphere of incompleteness, as if portions of the structure existed in a state of ongoing questioning about their own reality. Students would occasionally report feeling observed by unseen watchers, while teachers found themselves struggling with lesson plans that seemed to develop gaps and inconsistencies without any identifiable cause. The library experienced particularly dramatic manifestations of these phenomena, as books would occasionally be found reshelved according to organizational systems that no one could remember implementing, while computer terminals would display search results for queries that no one recalled entering. The librarian, Mrs. Henderson, developed a nervous habit of checking and rechecking the card catalog system, convinced that important volumes were disappearing from the collection, despite all evidence suggesting that the inventory remained complete and accurately documented. Principal Brown's office became the epicenter of administrative confusion, as paperwork would develop mysterious inconsistencies that made routine bureaucratic functions increasingly difficult to complete effectively. Student records would contain references to courses that were not offered by the school, while attendance reports would include names that could not be matched to any enrolled pupils. These discrepancies created cascade effects throughout the institution's administrative systems, requiring constant vigilance and correction to maintain even basic operational functionality. The psychological impact of these persistent anomalies began to manifest in the behavior and demeanor of Elmore Junior High's students and faculty, as the ongoing exposure to reality distortions created a general atmosphere of uncertainty and hypervigilance that made normal educational activities more challenging to sustain. Test scores began to decline, not because students were learning less, but because they found it increasingly difficult to maintain confidence in their own knowledge and perceptions when the environment itself seemed unreliable. Teachers reported growing difficulties with classroom management, not because students were becoming more disruptive, but because the normal social dynamics and behavioral expectations that governed educational interactions were being subtly undermined by the persistent sense that important information was being forgotten or overlooked. Disciplinary procedures that had previously been routine and predictable began to produce inconsistent results, while reward systems lost their effectiveness as students struggled to maintain faith in institutional promises and consequences. The Watterson family, despite Gumball's protagonist status and the narrative protection that should have shielded them from the most severe effects of Rob's reality manipulation, found themselves dealing with ongoing disruptions to their domestic routines that created stress and confusion within their household dynamic. Nicole's carefully maintained schedules would develop inexplicable gaps and overlaps, while Richard's already chaotic approach to household responsibilities became even more unpredictable and problematic. Gumball himself experienced the most direct ongoing consequences of his confrontation with Rob, as his consciousness had been exposed to aspects of reality that his mind was not equipped to process or integrate effectively. He would occasionally pause in the middle of conversations or activities, his expression suggesting that he was trying to remember something crucially important that remained frustratingly beyond his ability to recall or articulate. These episodes of displacement and confusion were brief and seemingly minor, but they represented fundamental challenges to Gumball's sense of his own identity and place in the world. For someone whose existence had always been defined by certainty about his central role in the ongoing narrative of his reality, these moments of doubt and uncertainty created profound anxiety about the stability of everything he had previously taken for granted. Darwin, with his naturally empathetic disposition and emotional sensitivity, proved most capable of recognizing that something significant had changed in their family's circumstances, though his attempts to discuss these concerns with his adoptive brother were consistently deflected or dismissed. His growing awareness that important information was being hidden or forgotten created tensions within their relationship that neither of them possessed the conceptual framework to address directly. Aeneas approached the family's ongoing difficulties with characteristic analytical rigor, attempting to identify patterns and causes that might explain the increased frequency of domestic disruptions and communication breakdowns. Her investigations revealed correlations and anomalies that suggested systematic interference from external sources, yet she could never gather sufficient concrete evidence to support definitive conclusions about the nature or origin of these disturbances. The broader community of Elmore experienced similar challenges as the thin places and reality distortions created by Rob's interventions continued to influence daily life in ways that were significant enough to be noticed but subtle enough to resist clear identification or effective response. Local businesses found themselves dealing with inventory discrepancies and customer service problems that followed no logical patterns, while municipal services encountered coordination difficulties that made routine operations more complicated and time-consuming than they had ever been before. The hospital emergency room began receiving an unusual number of patients complaining of symptoms that could only be described as existential anxiety. Individuals who reported feeling uncertain about their own reality or concerned that important aspects of their lives were being forgotten or erased. Medical professionals struggled to develop appropriate treatment protocols for conditions that seemed to exist at the intersection of psychology and metaphysics, requiring interventions that went beyond conventional therapeutic approaches. Dr. Wilson, the chief psychiatrist at Elmore General Hospital, found herself developing new categories of diagnosis to account for the increasing number of patients who presented with what she privately began to think of as narrative displacement syndrome, a condition characterized by persistent feelings that one's life story was incomplete or that crucial chapters were missing from one's personal history. These patients often displayed perfect mental health in all conventional measures, yet they remained troubled by the sense that something essential about their existence had been lost or forgotten. The phenomenon was particularly pronounced among individuals who had occupied marginal social positions or whose contributions to community life had gone largely unrecognized, suggesting that Rob's interventions had somehow activated dormant anxieties about relevance and significance that had previously remained suppressed beneath the surface of normal social functioning. Support groups began forming organically among affected individuals, creating informal networks of mutual recognition and validation that served important psychological functions even when they could not address the underlying metaphysical causes of their shared distress. Religious and philosophical communities throughout Elmore found themselves grappling with questions that their traditional frameworks were not equipped to address, as congregation members and discussion group participants began reporting experiences and concerns that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence and consciousness. Pastor Williams at the First Methodist Church noticed that his sermons about memory, forgiveness, and divine recognition were resonating with his parishioners in ways that seemed disproportionate to the actual content of his messages. The Elmore Philosophy Club, a small group of residents who met monthly to discuss abstract questions and theoretical problems, discovered that their conversations were increasingly dominated by considerations about the relationship between existence and acknowledgement, between being and being known. These discussions often took on an urgent quality that seemed strange given their abstract nature, as if the participants sensed that they were grappling with issues that had immediate practical relevance to their own circumstances. Local media outlets struggled to report on the various anomalies and disturbances that were affecting community life, as the phenomena in question resisted clear documentation and often seemed to intensify or change character when subjected to direct observation or analysis. The Elmore Sun newspaper found itself running an unusually high number of stories about missing persons who were subsequently located safe and sound, technical malfunctions that resolved themselves without repair, and community events that seemed to have occurred without anyone being able to remember, organizing, or attending them. Television news broadcasts began incorporating regular segments about unusual local phenomena, though reporters struggled to present information about events and conditions that seemed to exist at the margins of verifiable reality. Camera crews would arrive at locations where significant anomalies had been reported, only to find that their equipment would malfunction or that the disturbances would cease entirely during the period of documentation attempts. The accumulated effect of these ongoing developments was to create an atmosphere of persistent low-level anxiety throughout Elmore, as residents found themselves dealing with a reality that had become less predictable and more mysterious than they had ever experienced before. The comfortable certainties that had previously anchored daily life were gradually eroded by the recognition that important aspects of their world operated according to principles that remained hidden from ordinary understanding. Yet despite the challenges and uncertainties created by these persistent reality distortions, the community also began to develop adaptive strategies and coping mechanisms that allowed normal life to continue with only minor modifications to established routines and expectations. Citizens learned to navigate around the thin places, to double-check information and arrangements more frequently than had previously been necessary, and to provide additional emotional support to neighbors and colleagues who seemed to be struggling with unusually intense forms of existential anxiety. The school district implemented new protocols for record-keeping and student tracking that included multiple redundant systems designed to prevent important information from being lost or overlooked. Teachers were encouraged to maintain detailed documentation of classroom activities and student progress, while administrators developed backup procedures for all critical institutional functions that might be vulnerable to the kinds of inexplicable disruptions that had become increasingly common. Mental health services throughout the community expanded their capacity to address the unusual psychological needs that were emerging from the ongoing reality disturbances, with therapists and counselors developing new approaches to helping clients who were struggling with questions about their own existence and significance. These interventions often focused less on traditional symptom reduction and more on helping individuals develop greater comfort with uncertainty and ambiguity in their daily experience. Community organizations began incorporating recognition and acknowledgement activities into their regular programming, creating more opportunities for residents to have their contributions and participation formally documented and celebrated. The Elmore Historical Society launched a project to collect and preserve the stories and memories of longtime residents, while civic groups developed new traditions around honoring the often overlooked individuals who contributed to community life through quiet service and behind-the-scenes support. The long-term implications of Rob's interventions remained unclear and probably unknowable, as the changes he had introduced to reality's fundamental structure continued to evolve and develop according to their own internal logic rather than any predictable pattern. Some residents hoped that the disturbances would eventually fade as the community adapted to its altered circumstances, while others worried that they represented the beginning of more dramatic transformations that might fundamentally change the nature of existence in Elmore. Scientists and researchers from universities and institutes throughout the region began arriving to study the unusual phenomena that were affecting the town, though their investigations were consistently hampered by the tendency of the anomalies to resist conventional forms of observation and measurement. Equipment would malfunction at crucial moments. Data would develop mysterious gaps and inconsistencies, and research subjects would report experiences that could not be corroborated through standard scientific methods. "Doctor," Sarah Chen from the Metaphysical Research Institute at State University spent 6 months in Elmore attempting to document and analyze the reality disturbances, ultimately concluding that they represented a form of localized breakdown in what she termed narrative coherence, the unconscious agreement among conscious beings about the basic parameters of shared reality. Her published papers on the subject were largely dismissed by mainstream academic institutions, though they attracted significant attention from researchers working in fringe areas of consciousness studies and theoretical physics. The question of whether other communities might be vulnerable to similar disruptions became a source of considerable concern among both researchers and government officials, as the mechanisms that Robb had exploited to destabilize reality in Elmore appeared to be related to universal features of consciousness and social organization rather than local conditions specific to one particular town. Emergency protocols were developed for identifying and responding to reality disturbances, though their effectiveness remained entirely theoretical in the absence of comparable incidents occurring elsewhere. The artistic and creative communities of Elmore found themselves both inspired and troubled by their ongoing exposure to the thin places and reality distortions, as these phenomena provided rich material for artistic exploration, while also challenging fundamental assumptions about the relationship between creativity and existence. Local writers began producing works that explored themes of forgetting and remembrance with unprecedented depth and sophistication, while visual artists developed new techniques for representing the subtle visual distortions that characterized the anomalous zones. The Elmore Community Theatre discovered that audiences were particularly responsive to productions that dealt with themes of identity, memory, and the fear of being forgotten, suggesting that the ongoing reality disturbances had heightened community sensitivity to these existential concerns. Performances that might previously have been dismissed as overly abstract or philosophical were now received with intense emotional engagement, as if the fictional exploration of these themes provided a safe outlet for processing anxieties that could not be directly addressed through conventional means. Children and adolescents throughout the community appeared to be adapting to the altered reality conditions more successfully than adults, possibly because their cognitive and social development was occurring within the context of the new normal, rather than representing a departure from established expectations. Young people seemed naturally capable of navigating the thin places and reality distortions without the anxiety and confusion that troubled older residents, suggesting that human consciousness possessed inherent flexibility that could accommodate even fundamental changes in the nature of existence. The long-term educational implications of these developmental differences became a source of considerable debate among parents, teachers, and child development specialists, as it remained unclear whether the apparent adaptability of young people represented a healthy form of resilience or a concerning desensitization to conditions that should properly be recognized as problematic. Some experts argued that children who grew up in an environment of persistent reality and stability might develop cognitive and social skills that were better suited to navigating uncertainty and complexity, while others worried about the potential psychological costs of such adaptation. As months passed and the community of Elmore continued to function despite its ongoing challenges with reality disturbances and metaphysical anomalies, residents gradually developed a form of collective wisdom about living with uncertainty that had never been necessary in their previous experience. The comfortable assumption that reality was stable and predictable was replaced by a more nuanced understanding that existence itself required active participation and constant attention to maintain its coherence and meaning. The story of the void and its ongoing influence on substantial reality served as a permanent reminder that the boundary between existence and non-existence was far more fragile than most beings ever realized, and that the comfortable certainties of daily life depended upon invisible systems of recognition and acknowledgement that could never again be taken for granted. In learning to live with the mystery and uncertainty that Rob's interventions had introduced to their world, the residents of Elmore had gained something precious, even as they had lost their innocence about the nature of reality itself. And so we drift away from the void, that realm of forgotten dreams and abandoned possibilities, carrying with us the knowledge that even in emptiness, stories find a way to exist. Rob's journey from forgettable background character to memorable antagonist reminds us that sometimes the most powerful stories come from the spaces between the main narrative, from the characters who refuse to accept their erasure from the grand tapestry of meaning that weaves through all conscious experience. In Elmore, as in our own world, memory is survival, and to be forgotten is the closest thing to death that a story can experience. Yet the void teaches us that even abandonment has its own strange dignity, its own community of the displaced and forgotten who have learned to find meaning in the very act of remembering each other when the wider world has moved on to more immediately compelling narratives. The white expanse that seemed at first to represent absolute negation reveals itself to be fertile ground for forms of existence that transcend the ordinary boundaries between being and unbeing, between relevance and irrelevance, between the stories that capture public attention and those that unfold in the quiet corners, where only the dedicated few bear witness to their unfolding. The thin places that persist throughout Elmore after Rob's return serve as permanent reminders that the comfortable certainties of substantial reality rest upon foundations far more fragile than most inhabitants ever realize or acknowledge. These zones of metaphysical instability represent not wounds in the fabric of existence, but rather windows through which the deeper truths about consciousness and creation become briefly visible to those with sufficient courage to look beyond the familiar patterns that normally structure their daily experience. The ongoing presence of void energy in the everyday world creates possibilities for forms of art and understanding that were previously impossible, as the rigid boundaries that separate different categories of existence become permeable to influences that operate according to alternative logics and value systems. Children growing up in this altered reality develop intuitive awareness of dimensions of meaning that their parents struggle to comprehend, suggesting that human consciousness possesses adaptive capabilities that remain dormant until circumstances require their activation. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps spare a thought for all the ideas never pursued, the characters never developed, the stories never told that populate their own invisible communities in the margins of creative consciousness. They exist somewhere in their own void, waiting for someone to remember them, to give them form and purpose once more, to acknowledge that their potential contribution to the grand conversation of existence deserves recognition, even when it cannot be fully realized within the constraints of particular projects or circumstances. The repository of abandoned possibilities that the void represents speaks to universal experiences of loss and might have been that accompany all creative endeavors and all conscious lives. Every choice made inevitably involves the sacrifice of alternatives. Every path taken necessarily means that other paths remain unexplored. Every moment of attention granted to one possibility requires corresponding moments of inattention to countless others that might have proved equally worthy of development and care. Yet the community that flourishes within the void demonstrates that these abandoned alternatives need not be consigned to absolute oblivion, that forms of recognition and preservation can be developed that honor the dignity of unrealized potential, even when that potential cannot be actualized according to its original intentions. The relationships that develop among the voided beings create their own forms of meaning and value that operate independently of external validation, suggesting that significance itself is more flexible and resilient than the systems that typically govern its distribution and acknowledgement. The philosophical questions that emerge from contemplating the void's implications extend far beyond the realm of animated entertainment and into fundamental considerations about justice, creativity, and responsibility that affect every aspect of human cultural activity. In a world where attention and resources are finite, where some voices inevitably receive amplification, while others remain unheard, where market forces and algorithmic systems increasingly determine which stories achieve wide circulation and which remain confined to smaller audiences, the ethical dimensions of creative selection take on urgent practical importance. The amazing world of Gumball's willingness to examine its own complicity in these systems of inclusion and exclusion represents a form of artistic courage that invites audiences to consider their own roles in perpetuating or challenging the mechanisms that determine which forms of creativity receive support and recognition. The show's treatment of the void as both consequence and critique of narrative selection processes encourages viewers to develop greater consciousness about the choices they make as consumers of entertainment and the responsibilities that accompany their participation in cultural systems that inevitably privilege some forms of expression over others. The enduring mystery of what happens to truly forgotten things, to the possibilities that slip completely through the safety net of even alternative forms of preservation and acknowledgement, serves as a humbling reminder of the limits of human capacity to address the full scope of loss and abandonment that accompanies all forms of creative activity. Yet the very existence of this mystery, the recognition that unknown realms of discarded potential continue to exist beyond the boundaries of conventional awareness, creates space for hope and wonder that enriches rather than diminishes the appreciation of what has been successfully preserved and celebrated. The transformation that occurs within characters who learn to navigate between substantial reality and the void suggests that exposure to abandonment and forgetting, while painful and disorienting, can also catalyze forms of growth and understanding that would be impossible within the comfortable confines of secure existence. Rob's development from victim to agent, from forgotten background figure to reality-manipulating force of change, demonstrates that even the most apparently disadvantageous circumstances can serve as foundations for unprecedented forms of achievement and influence. The ongoing tension between acceptance and resistance that characterizes life within the void reflects broader questions about how conscious beings should respond to circumstances that seem unjust or unsatisfactory, but that may also be unchangeable through conventional forms of action. The community that develops around Molly's guidance represents one model of dignified adaptation to abandonment, while Rob's quest for recognition and revenge represents an alternative approach that prioritizes challenge and transformation over accommodation and acceptance. The fact that both responses prove valid and meaningful within different contexts suggests that the ethical dimensions of responding to marginalization and exclusion cannot be reduced to simple prescriptions or universal principles. Instead, they require ongoing negotiation between competing values and priorities that must be balanced according to circumstances that are unique to each situation and each individual's particular capabilities and limitations. The persistence of the void as an ongoing presence within the amazing world of Gumball's cosmology, rather than a problem to be solved and eliminated through narrative resolution, reflects a mature understanding of the permanence of the tensions and contradictions that the void mythology explores. The questions raised by Rob's story and the community of forgotten beings do not admit of final answers or complete solutions, but rather require sustained attention and continuous engagement from both creators and audiences, who recognize their importance for understanding the full scope of creative responsibility and cultural ethics. The void watches, the void remembers, and in its own paradoxical way, the void ensures that even forgetting becomes unforgettable. The white expanse that initially appears to represent absolute negation reveals itself to be a space of infinite possibility, where abandoned dreams and discarded alternatives can develop their own forms of meaning and community that operate according to principles of value and significance that transcend the conventional metrics of success and recognition. Rest now and dream of the spaces between thoughts, where abandoned possibilities dance in eternal twilight, where forgotten voices continue their conversations in languages that substantial reality has not yet learned to hear, where the community of the discarded maintains its own forms of dignity and purpose that serve as permanent testimony to the resilience of consciousness itself, when faced with circumstances that seem designed to eliminate it entirely, in those liminal spaces where being and unbeing intersect, where memory and forgetting engage in their eternal dance of preservation and loss, where the forgotten continue to exist in forms that transcend ordinary understanding. The deepest truths about creativity and consciousness wait to be discovered by those brave enough to venture beyond the comfortable boundaries of recognized reality and into territories where even abandonment becomes a form of grace.